So Philip is awesome, and I really, really enjoyed speaking to him last time on the Negentropic Breadboard. Frick yeah, and all that we got into there. I always enjoy when he shows up at the net. We have so much fun. That's always a blast, and he always has tremendous insight. And so, Philip, what you been thinking about? What you been thinking about, Philip?
Ditto, Daniel. Happy to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm thinking about that pink Energizer bunny. I'm always thinking about energy. And I got a question. I got a question for you. We were talking a little bit about Zach Stein's metapsychology and this idea of the tripartite of ensoulment, development, and transcendence. And I wonder what you kind of think as far as energy relating to those three categories.
Magnificent. Well, Zach Stein is wonderful. I really like his work. And I'm looking forward to reading his new book that I know he has out, and he's doing the class at Parallax. So that's tremendous. I think definitely with metacognition in general, I think in belonging again to one, there's a real emphasis on Nash equilibria being a result of autonomous rationality, which results in a defining of rationality where when everyone does what is thus rational, you end up with a suboptimal result. And so, for example, a good classic example is traffic, right? And Marcuse will talk about this in like One Dimensional Man. It's rational to get home from, if you dislike your job and you want to get home, it's rational to leave the office as quickly as possible, right? But if everybody does that, then you just sit in traffic for 45 minutes. And actually would have been, in a sense, more rational is to wait 10 minutes for things to cool down, and then you're able to just kind of go home without sitting there. And maybe you actually could sit there and work on your novel you've already wanted to do, as opposed to sit in traffic being angry, right? So if you simply follow what seems to be the rational course of action, you end up in a suboptimal result. Well, just apply that to economics, government, and everything. You could also talk about things like the Kenneth era. I've been thinking about public choice phenomenon, where if you have fair elections, there ends up being a weird contradiction between individual preference and social good that arises constantly. Well, that doesn't make sense. So you have to generate an unfair election in order to get social good. Well, that doesn't sound right. And likewise, if you have everyone, for example, do what's rational when owning a stock, which would be, buying low and selling high, well, then there would be no opportunity, right? Because everyone would just be following. The opportunity of the market actually arises from going against what everyone else is doing, so that you sell when everyone is buying, and you buy when everyone is selling, right? So these are just a few examples. And for Mr. Zach Stein, I think there's a profound understanding. As you know, I talk all the time about autonomous rationality that is separated from any contingency, embodiedness, embeddedness, to use a Carl Planier language, that then leads to these suboptimal results in many different ways. For example, in following counter-enlightenment thinkers, only someone who was in this room could determine what might be the rational course of action regarding the temperature. Because if it's hot, if you're in here, you would know, oh, it becomes, rational to bring in a air conditioner. But if you were making a decision of what would be rational for all rooms and all houses at all times, you're probably going to get a whole lot of inefficiency going on. So you have to have that embeddedness. And I think also on the notion of ensoulment, there's this idea that whatever sort of structure or identity or metaphysics that you have, it ultimately has to be seen as the driving principle of the thing that is embodied or that is particularized, as opposed to something that is a soul. I like how the ensoulment, like you were saying, because that's different from just talking about a soul. It has something like an animating principle that is in operation. And I think that also then right there is a kind of language, if we think about rationality, that's an embodied rationality that is in operation, right? The transcendent is also very interesting and I think important as well. And I'm not saying I'm an expert in all of Mr. Stein's language, so feel free to take this any way you want. But when we think about transcendence as well, I also have to make decisions relative to spaces that are not around me, that are not in this room, that in a sense are transcended horizontally, but that could also be in light of a vertical transcendence as well. Say if you believe in a God, or you believe in, say, maybe long-termism, some of these new forms of affected altruism. So you have a horizontal, which is spatially based outside the kind of frame, the finite frame by which I'm operating with Alex, Alex Ebert would talk about that. But then you could also have a vertical transcendence that's an operation as well. And what's very interesting about all of those is that they function as a kind of check and balance on each. In the sense that, okay, you have a vertical transcendence, well, you better make sure there's an embeddedness, there's an ensoulment, there's a particularity, because the moment you don't do that, it could be autonomous and destructive. Oh, and by the way, you better have a horizontal one as well, or you're stuck in this room forever. Oh, well, it's not going to do simply to be bodied. You need to be ensouled. You need to have some sort of transcendent variable in operation, some sort of value system, because I know he emphasizes values. So you also have to be thinking about something more meta and more abstract. And all of these come into operation to give one, say, motivation or, valuation, the mechanisms by which to make a choice. And I think all of this, although I obviously use very different language in Belonging Again, the argument would be that we have a conception of economics that is still based on a very one-dimensional man, following, to use that Marcuse language, or a very flat person, the rational actor, right? Well, that means economics is based on basically we are motivated by what we think is rational. So a kind of single variable rationality, right? Well, it makes sense then, like Mikey teaches, that capitalism or capital leads to AI, because that tends to be a more disembodied single variable intelligence, right? But if we define human beings that way, then why in the world should human beings be part of the socioeconomic system? What can they add to it? So you get so to kind of speak on the metacrisis, and I'll give back to you, if we have a conception of the human being that is not, dare I say, fuller, or terms like menti-divergent, they're able to think, their mentality is able to diverge from a single Nash equilibrium track, like a hallway in Kafka. And if they're able to think more fully, if we're not able to think that kind of person, then the metacrisis is rational. It's the rational outcome of a single variable rationality that defines economic man that tends to be in the background of all of our modeling, which, please note, it's kind of like we want man to be one-dimensional because that's easier to model. Like, the models become more effective, and this is where the maps aren't the territory, but start making the territory. We start believing what the territory is based on what we want the map to say. And if the map isn't the territory, so much for that's worse off for the territory. And that then creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of the metacrisis, which would mean something transcendent of that Kafkaesque hallway or Nash equilibrium is necessary. But the key to this, I think, is that the transcendence as such has to be located in the finitude. Like I was talking with Nance and Dave on the finite and the sacred and different things in the book. And the notion is as well, like you have to have the mechanism of the transcendence change the way of thinking and ensoulment, embodiment, and action of the agent in the finite frame that is carrying out in the economic system. In a way to put that is, Zizek has that from Bartleby, that famous phrase, I prefer not to, and it's funny because when he says that, like, to resist the injunction to enjoy, and he's got this whole notion of kind of capitalism as having this ability to kind of work on your wants and different things, then the revolutionary act is not to necessarily oppose capitalism, because whatever you do will just absorb it in, like Snowpiercer or something. It absorbs the revolution. It's to stand in the midst of capitalism and say, I prefer not to. Well, that's very menti-divergent. That would require a different kind of thinking. And a lot of what I take Zach Stein's work to be is almost like what Zizek is saying, I prefer not to, in the middle of capitalism. Zach Stein is giving a model with Gaffney, because I know he works with Gaffney so much, of a similar subject in the middle of the metacrisis that would, by changing kind of a faithful presence, to use Hunter's language, the operations of it would change how the metacrisis unfolds. And actually, then it becomes a kind of positive feedback loop, because as that kind of agency transforms the metacrisis, that can inspire you to keep doing it. Then other people see what it's doing. There's a beauty to it that then it motivates people, and you get a negentropic, dare I say, or menti-divergent energy and motivation and operation. And it would seem basically, and this is obviously, I'm framing this in terms of Belonging Again 2.1 as well, because I definitely see Stein as thinking in that orbit. I think anything that's going to deal with the metacrisis has to start with the subject. And I was speaking with Cadell about that. And it can't simply be solution problem. It has to be a day in, day out way that the subject carries themselves and that they're motivated by and changes how they think. And it has to be more like a seed that grows from the subject that moves through the different subjects to change the kind of subject liberation, as I've heard like Daniel Tutt say in different things, that then starts to work on the metacrisis. And I think Zach Stein has a similar emphasis, although correct me if I'm wrong, on when there's this emphasis on education, this emphasis on different ways of, I think Mr. Gaffney talks about cosmic eroticism, like these different ways of thinking about libidinal energy, structuring of the subject. I completely concur with the notion that this is the only way to think things like the metacrisis. Like, as I was saying with Cadell, and then I'll give it back to you and feel free to respond to anything, is that if you focus on solving the metacrisis and then the subject, you do neither. It's the first things first principle of C.S. Lewis. You put second things first, you lose both. But if you focus on the subject, then you also take care of the metacrisis. But you have to get the order right. And very often, because of how the brain works, we're like, we can't worry about slowly working through subjectivity and changing that. We got to save the world right now. That's precisely the kind of attitude that dooms the world. Because, you know, what you fear is what comes unto you, as a phrase Michelle and I like. Instead, we have to think of changing the operations of the subject, which then other people see, inspiring them to change the operations of the subject. And beautifully, in the very virilio, fast speed, cybernetic, hyperspeed internet world that's destroying us, that actually could accelerate the changing of the conditions of possibility. So this thing that's like usually an incredibly slow sociological process actually may be faster than it usually has been in history because of the very cybernetics or internet that's destroying attention, could actually increase the rate of changing the conditions of possibility that in history may have taken 50 years. Now maybe it only takes 5. Now maybe it only takes 10, right? I'm not saying it takes a month, but these new technologies may have actually kind of indirectly arisen as a way to accelerate changes of conditions of possibility in a world where the metacrisis seems to have this ever accelerating tension and arrival of these different problems. So it gives me hope in that regard. But the thing that gives me hope is also the thing that destroys focus and makes us addicted to dopamine, right? So hope always comes with fire. But let me give it to you, Philip, for anything you'd like to respond to. You're so beautiful. Oh my gosh, you're beautiful.
I think it's learning about those dopaminergic systems. What Gaffney talks a lot about is the difference between eros and pseudo eros. And so the term I've coined is autopoeros, as far as how does the subject as a self-directing and progressing system find ways of both working on and tearing down self-images based on, you know, how it's serving them as they're moving through whatever point in time. And the thing about the seed that you brought up made me think like the absolute choice actually happens before, you know, the epididymis. That is to say, we are all single-celled organisms that you know, expand, and none of what we've ever been is not what we are. We're all the children that we were. We're all the teenagers that we were. So this like embodied, like boots on the ground, really, really informs cognition, which I think can allow us to kind of see just how much we've adapted since we were babies. Like we're millennials, right? You and I.
Yes.
So I remember I was in 6th grade when 9/11 happened. They wheeled out one of those TVs with a little VCR thing on top, showed us we got out of school early, and people are saying this is the event. This is the event of the generation. Well, then 2008. Shoot, even before that was Y2K. And then you get you know, the war in Iraq, you get the pandemic. So our ability to adapt, like you said, is both super joyous and terrifying. And it comes back to the dopamine, in the sense that, like, what you were saying earlier about agency, I think is key.
Mm.
Whether or not we have a choice to seek human connection versus its, representation in the digital sphere, I think is like really big. And there's a lot of gradation in all of that. There's a difference between talking on Zoom, sending a text, uh, dropping a line on Facebook. Um, and all of these things inform the subjects being in the world and how they're dealing with the metacrisis. So when it comes to transcendence, when it comes to development, when it comes to ensoulment is primary, but that doesn't mean it's the main thing or the major thing, as Zach says. So if you do all of this development, say you get super smart, super good at one skill, you become Nietzsche's dwarf, right? With the big ear. Or you sit and meditate, maybe you like get a Nintartan level, like Zen calm. But if those aren't ensouled, right? The idea is whatever, you gain the world and you lose your soul. And so how, like, this is my question with the lever with belonging again. Do you belong with yourself, if that makes sense? That is to say that there's like a certain type of alienation that is probably necessary in order to work on the development, to work on the transcendence. But how do you not become so alienated from your own ensoulment such that group membership isn't something that every time you're almost there, this sort of jouissance comes up and is like, yeah, no thanks. Just like the traffic example, like people like traffic. This is this is like to hate it, like stuff like this. And then when it comes to everything you were saying about the increase in speed, I think this is one of the biggest potential breakthroughs for time energy.
Mm.
Because I think, like, on some level it might be like we might get it with this constant temptation of garbage time, that like somehow you got to be like, no, not yet. uh I am gonna move. You talked about motivation from an intrinsic motivation, and I feel like that can make such a big difference, and for that it helps to belong to a community that recognizes and appreciates work that's being done outside the market.
Magnificent. A few things. I really like that pseudo erotica. That's very interesting from Gaffney and the auto of what you were saying, Kinesis. I think definitely. So, there's a few things. First off, the belonging again will argue that throughout most of history, belonging has been based on givens that require a certain exclusivity and also a certain concealing of what is called in part one of the conflict of society, which is the impossibility of a social horizon to ground itself in anything objective, ultimately, because now the language is a little different, but it's kind of the Kurt Gödel problem. Well, this is a problem because society has authority precisely because you don't think it's just a society, you think it's the society, right? You don't think that America is just a cultural option, because if you did, it would lose authority, right? It would lose the ability to bind you. It has to become the cultural option. Well, then society, to function as such, has to perpetually kind of conceal anything that would make you question that sort of authority, right? And that gets into where, in failing that, you get the legitimization crisis of a Habermas, or you start to go, oh, wait, the way I grew up wasn't the way to grow up. It was just a way to grow up. I could have been different. Well, how do I know that what I believe? And you go crazy, right? And society has always operated through various mechanisms of concealment. So the argument is that for most of history, belonging has not actually even been belonging. It's been at best a kind of pseudo belonging. That's why the again is very important, because what would it mean to belong again without regressing, right? Also, too, belonging is highly tied. If you, well, we were talking, if you right now are starting like an online community or doing a lot of work and you're not being socially recognized or paid for it, then you don't have belonging. Right, that if there is not a structural structure of recognition of the value that you create, then you don't feel like you belong in that society, right? You feel like you're sort of cut out. Also, the other sense of belonging is that the book talks about is the ability to belong without givens, which would have to mean that you have a new foundation for the way that you live a life that also doesn't feel arbitrary but authoritative. Well, that is kind of contradictory, because if you choose it, you know it could have been different. So how do you choose something that then has a certain authority over you? It's not a mere preference that then becomes the basis of grounding who you are, ergo an absolute choice, that you would kind of tie yourself to, almost like Ulysses with the wax in his ears with the sirens, regardless if it even cost you. Like, it's one thing to die for something in history if you believe God commanded it of you. It's entirely something else to die for something that you chose and know you chose, right? But here's the funny thing. That level of sacrifice is necessary for a feeling of belonging. That's the opposite of belonging as such is a certain feeling of arbitrariness, belonging and arbitrariness, where you're like, oh, I could have been different. What does it matter to have money? You feel there's a certain nihilism, a bad nihilism there. But then, of course, this good nihilism, which is the absolute choice, requires, in a sense, the lack of givens to have this powerful ability to choose the way that you live and find belonging with others who recognize you, that is simultaneously recognized by the socioeconomic system, because then there's something radically powerful about that, because it's not external. Like, even if you believe you do something because you believe God told you to do, well, you're just doing it then because God told you to do it, right? You're just dying because you believe you might go to heaven or something, right? What would it mean to find belonging and recognition in a radical absolute choice? And so the question of belonging, again, in that sense, is belonging for the first time, and it's in terms of something very different that perhaps was only possible at this sort of historical moment. But the existential weight of this problem then leads to the return to popularism, tribalism, Duginism, nihilism, atomization, because the sociological pressures are so extraordinary. Another way to put this, in the past, you had necessity. Like, if you wanted, right now, Guy Senstock was saying this the other day at the net. Like, we don't really, and King Laugh was saying this, we don't really need one another, right? Like, we don't need one another as much. We don't need community to survive, right? So if we're going to interact with other people, we're not so much compelled by necessity, right? Well, people are hard, though. Like, people don't understand you. You're reading philosophy. Why are you doing that? Are you going to be a college professor? No. And it's awkward and it's embarrassing and you feel naked. So then you don't go see those people anymore, right? Because difference is hard, right? So in order, though, so right there, when you choose your interactions, there's a certain sort of difficulty you have to face, that then the way you avoid that tends to be by talking about your job, or talking about capital, or telling people, oh, actually, I'm going to be a professor. It's a kind of putting the fig leaf on in Eden, right? That's how human beings, through most of history, have dealt with the other. And the critical thing with that is, as much as we like to bash capital as reductionistic and reducing us, that's really been the only way we've ever been able to deal with pluralism or difference on a global scale, is by treating one another as our jobs, or worth 200K a year. Because otherwise we have to get into Christianity or Hinduism. Oh, that's a whole nother ballgame. And I don't even have the skills to talk about those things without having a meltdown. So we tend to then retract and isolate, right? To truly belong, we would have to be able to choose pluralism without mediation, or as much mediation, which of course is impossible for anyone to do all at once. So you have to have gradual processes of unveiling and warming up to one another, right? You have to have a kind of orbiting structure. And that, I think, actually gets Mr. Jockin. We were talking on kind of how lack has to be something you orbit, with the negative pragmatism Javier was talking about. There is something here that is required of an orbiting to get more and more used to it. because if you do it too quickly, you're destroyed. And this is where lack is dangerous, as Jockin was emphasizing, because if you go at it all at once, it destroys you and you confuse reality with the image. Lack makes that possible. But then removing lack entirely, or this present absence, then makes you have the meaning crisis, or we have no means to mediate one another on some sort of ontological ground. We've tried to mediate one another on grounds of being, but that leads to mistakes of totality, self-effacement, and so on. Well, could we relate on grounds of lack, which then kind of helps anyone having a power claim on it because it's lack, but it's not nothing, so it's not nihilism. Well, the structure of that must be an orbit to where we can kind of warm up to one another so that we're not overwhelmed by. So it's almost like today we need orbiting instead of mediation, or movement from mediation to orbiting. Now, you could make an argument that the screen here is a kind of mediation, right? You know, I'm not in your presence. And actually, to be positive again, maybe the screen here is a form of mediation that's necessary to kind of warm up into the orbiting structure that is not as reductionistic as the mediation of capital, right? Like the screen could actually be a good, like a kind of step in the direction of a socio-economic system that's orbiting lack. And I would argue that basically we need to think economics like the Lithuania Free Market Institute was talking about, and we had those conversations with them. We need to think about capitalism orbiting lack versus scarcity. That's like lack is the negation sublation of scarcity. And this seems to be the central kind of ontological basis for something that would be able to deal with global pluralism that was not overwhelmed by it, but it would have to have this orbiting structure. And then we would have to use technology in a certain way. And there's a few more things. I think part of the problem is we need to stop talking about technology as a kind of mono technology. Like when I go to my toolbox, I know a wrench is not the same as a hammer. I know a nail is not the same as a screw. These have different functions. And if you try to use one for the other, you get big problems. And as we've talked about before, I think there's a very big difference between Zoom and Instagram, or Zoom and Twitter, or Twitter and cell phone and flip phone. We have to be very discerning about these different technologies, because the likelihood of a technology leading to a destructive liaison versus a certain actual erotica or eros of Dante that pulls us toward the lack, the tool we use could pre-frame the activity that follows to greatly decrease or increase the probability of this proper circling. Like, I'm of the opinion that the probability of orbiting lack on text messaging is far less than on a Zoom call, right? Both technologies, but the medium matters for this kind of thing, right? So we have to become discerning about the probability of, say, Zoom, because I'm pretty bullish on Zoom, as you know, just because it allows this ability to communicate with people of great diversity all around the world at various levels of unveiling or development, that the probability of encountering those people in your locality would be remarkably low. So Zoom helps deal with a information sorting problem that has never been solved in human history, that allows the probability of this orbiting issue and creating community, absolute communities or milieus that then can get a sort of movement of belonging according to a new paradigm that increases the probability of larger recognition and then economic sustainability that would deal with the problem of belonging in terms of orbiting the lack, if you will, in these terms. So I'm pretty bullish on Zoom, but that's very different from the cell phone, because I think the cell phone basically destroys focus, right? Like there's always a buzz in your pocket. So we have to become discerning about these technologies and the probability of X technology leading to capture by the algorithm or perverted liaisons versus a technology that would actually help the development of these milieus, to use McKerracher's language, while directing eros, to use the Dante term, or the erotica of Garner, in a direction that loves the lack. Because here's the key. We're saying you have to orbit the lack, right? In this kind of negative pragmatism. To me, negative pragmatism, to use that language from Javier, would require a situation, a commitment to the situation, and a process of unveiling. Those are kind of the three things that I think would be required for the metageometry of a relation to lack that was not problematic, right? You would need a situation, a commitment to the situation, and basically a gradual orbiting that's getting closer and closer and closer. Well, that's the movement of Dante in the Paradiso. That's the movement of orbiting beauty. That's the movement of being pulled into it, but at a rate you can handle, right? So what we have to do is use the technology to create basically a model or simulation of that situation that we see in Plato, that we see in Dante, and that would be the situation in which negative pragmatism as such could occur, and technology could aid that. And if we do not do that, you made this point how people enjoy traffic. That's exactly right, because when you have autonomous rationality, the only way to live with it is to enjoy the hardship. You have to enjoy the destruction. You have to enjoy the liaison. You have to enjoy talking about it. Otherwise, you change it, right? The problem with autonomous rationality is it eventually finds a way to enjoy its disembodiedness or its destructiveness or its self-deception or its irony. It basically has to. And if the society also doesn't show alternative ways of living, why would it think that it shouldn't, or that it could do something else? And so that's why then the development of, say, these milieus or scenes, or using the technology to show these different ways of thinking and speaking and operating, become incredibly important. Because, you know, in Christianity, they talk about evangelism, you know, handing out the tracts and different things. I think there's a difference between handing out tracts and showing something beautiful that attracts people in. I'm all about the evangelism of attraction, if you will. And I think basically, if you create places of belonging that are not regressive, but belonging found in a certain orbiting of a certain lack that develops a certain subjectivity that is able to easily say, I prefer not to go out on Friday night and spend a bunch of money drinking because I would prefer to be here talking with Philip. And then the prefer not to is not something you don't enjoy that you're doing out of guilt, but actually you just find yourself preferring not to because you're so taken by the dance and the love that moves the other stars. And that would then function as the sort of against the injunction to enjoy that is found in this kind of destructive liaisons, the enjoyment of hating traffic or autonomous rationality that is found in the movement of eros that we see in Dante, that I believe Gaffney could be pointing to as well. But again, I'm not extremely caught up on his work, but I always enjoy listening to him and enjoy Mr. Stein's work. But that movement of the erotic, the eros, is also the movement, in my opinion, of liaisons according to a non-destructive movement that moves it into drive as well, versus from the desire, because that's a big thing. So you're moving it into drive. And I think you can look at these technologies, figure out the ones that help create the situation to commit people to the orbiting according to an absolute choice that structures the subject differently to not fall into the metacrisis. I think you can do all of those things, show that to other people, spread the conditions of possibility, spread the conditions of transparency in these technologies that right now seem to be on the side of capturing or automation or destroying focus, could also contain in themselves the logic of their own negation sublation. If we so design it, if you will, if we are so intentional about it and we work in that direction. I'd be curious to anything that you have to say about that. And a lot of belonging, again, is going to be talking about all of this. So please.
It's important to say that that's a two-way street, right? So there are both bad borrowers and bad lenders. There are engineers that know the tech stack updates they're bringing into the world have, you know, high probability that, you know, for example, a lot of teenage girls will feel bad about their bodies. There are also ways of using it that each of us know we could probably use a little less of. Sometimes the question, though, is, well, what else is there? This circling around nothing sounds like philosophy to me. This is what, like, I'm paradoxically, I'm bullish on philosophy, and I'm like quite pessimistic both about humans in their relation to technology and technology as such. I don't know how that's going to work out, but I'm sure it will. So the idea is, like, how do you make that a ritual of circling a void appealing, alluring in an ecosystem of anti-rituals that essentially try to shortcut that with a group of people who may be more or less aware of their entire mathematical computation being this algebra of I put in the least to get out the most, and moving that to a geometry that starts looking at the uniqueness of each individual that you interact with, your own unique self, the mystery, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of this is encouraging mentee divergence and being in a space with someone where if they go off in some direction or another one, it's not like a grinding halt. Like you continue the song, you continue the dance, and you how do you get there though if like the education is like sit still for 6 hours and look like look at me, and I'm going to teach you a bunch of stuff that you'd probably be better off not knowing. This is sort of an interesting question, I think, like how do we teach kids, and then how do the adults act as exemplars? Like you, obviously, great exemplar. You're outside twirling staffs. You're like fighting with your kids, having a good time. They're learning their bodies. They're learning a bunch of math and stuff like this. There's people who are just on their phones all the time. And I don't think, I don't want to demonize the phone. This is not a just say no to drugs. This is a question of how do we use this? And to quote Alexander Bard, he would say that the most important thing that you do in the morning is to ask yourself, like, what do I want from the digital technologies? And this, I, if you do that, probably you'll start realizing your habits. You're like, oh, I want to look at it for like, I don't know, some geopolitics and to catch up with my friends. And like every single time there's some kind of emotional hiccup in your day, if that's the thing, that's actually kind of useful feedback because you could be like, oh, okay. And it's not the individual's fault. I don't want to like point a finger at an individual. Like these things are so powerful. It's insane. Like, do you ever think just how, like, you ever think about your grandpa? Okay. How many images did that guy see in his life compared to us, right? And it's not like it's very possible that he saw more images in his real life, but just like the amount of stuff. But it would have been like, this is a sort of a local take of what's going on. And our brains like haven't changed that much since our grandparents. Uh, so I think when it comes to this question of, kind of the horror and the terror, the Landian, Lovecraftian possible future, you take that and say, actually, well, you tell me, do you think that may also be the precondition for this belonging again that you're talking about?
Excellent. You said a lot that was really, really good. So a few things. First off, it is not productive, in my opinion, to demonize anything or to say if we only remove then. Because there is a history, so a big thing that the belonging again, we'll try to argue again, not that I keep trying to reference it, but I'm referencing it, so I'm joking. So it's just is the notion is that there's a long history that's kind of more libertarian on the notion that if you create freedom, then you'll create prosperity. Like if you just free people from the technology or you free people from government or whatever, that leads to prosperity. Not even Adam Smith thought this. He thought that prosperity led to freedom because the business people then created ways for the feudal lords to waste all their money. They couldn't maintain their estate, and then freedom occurred. And if you go through history, you don't see a doctrine to think that you change subjectivity only by removing something. You have to negate sublate, right? So the cell phone is not necessarily the enemy. Now, I don't have a cell phone precisely because they are so powerful. And I didn't see the value add to getting one versus, say, a flip phone or just using email or Zoom, right? But definitely you could use the cell phone to do all sorts of extraordinary things. And in fact, your life is not going to necessarily improve by getting rid of it, right? Because you may get rid of it and just, I don't know, go watching VHS or something, right? Unless you're going to be all in as Amish, right? Like, to me, if you have a strategy of technological sort of obstinance, like removing yourself from it, well, then you need to go all the way to the Amish, right? And by the way, but if you do that, then you are saying that the only proper sociological address is a kind of withdrawal or isolationism, right? That seems to work, but that's not the interest of belonging again. Like, it's very clear that there are various sociological strategies that in a sense work, but I'm not sure if they work by dealing with the problem of global pluralism. They tend to work by avoiding the problem of global pluralism, and I would put that in the camp.
The question of scale is the question.
Yes, sir, it is. It is 1,000,000,000% the question. Absolutely. Exactly. So I'm not saying, like, I do think it is natural for people to use the cell phone and do so thoughtlessly. That is the character of all technology, is to make you not think about your use of it. It's very similar to Kierkegaard, where he's like, the man in despair doesn't know he's in despair. If you know you're in despair, you're on the fast path out, right? Likewise, if you have a technology and don't know it's captured you, you're screwed. But the moment you say, this thing's trying to capture me, your ability to use it is probably quite good, right? Now, there are also some practical strategies, I think, that you can use. Like, if you use your cell phone, you need to have a purpose, like a reason, because that becomes the binding principle for what you're doing, so you don't get caught in a kind of spurious infinity scrolling, right? But if you say, like, I can just tell you with the wedding venue, like, the ability to use social media lowers our marketing costs profoundly and allows us to do target marketing that is incredible, that you could not do without Instagram or Facebook. And you could even use the demographic data to really look for people who are going to probably meet your aesthetic, right? That's all amazing and probably reduces waste. And also, like, if we think about it, for most of history, like, business was bound to a certain coordination problem in that you didn't know when somebody with demand would show up at your store. So you had to stay in the store all day, and Dave taught, like, the energy, it's the wage energy, where you're just there waiting to give it over. Even if you're not working, you're on standby, right? You're always on standby. Cell phones and these technologies could help this problem of the standby problem, if you will, the coordination problem, because you could have more targeted information to determine where is demand. And in one way, though, that could be very dangerous, because what if the system's then finding us and marketing us and manipulating us? But in another way, it could help with the standby problem, right? It just depends on, if the moment you're aware that when you click one video on YouTube, you get 1,000 more, and that they're manipulating you, your likelihood of being manipulated, or at least I find, goes down quite a bit. Likewise, if you know that marketing is perpetually trying to manipulate you, the likelihood of you wasting money goes down quite a bit, but then you're able to use it to do more efficient marketing that saves you an unbelievable amount of time, because you don't just have to be at the venue all day waiting for somebody to come by, and you never know. Well, you know exactly when they're coming by, because you have targeted marketing information that this technology makes possible. So certainly we don't want to demonize. I do think, though, the cell phone is very difficult to use it and not have it destroy focus. So you just have to be aware of that. If you have let me put it this way, if you have a cell phone, you really need to read books. Like, that's the antidote, right? Like, just think of it that way. For every technology you choose to have, you need to have a counter practice. For every hot medium, you need a cold medium, as McLuhan would say, right? That's going to help give you the right balance, because maybe cell phone plus books equals the ability to have super focus, but also diversity in that super focus, right? Because you're able to see a bunch of images and then bring them together. I definitely think the book today is quite unique from books in the past because of the internet. It seems very much able to bring lots of thinkers together into unique combinations that books like Ulysses or The Wasteland could only allude to. You see a very different intellect, in my opinion. You're starting to see a kind of intellectual work that is very gathering. It has a strong gathering character to it that may not have been possible without these technologies. It's always give and take. It's always give and take. So I would confirm that. On everything you were saying about it's a two-way street, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, it 100% is. And so if you were to say, oh, and before I forget, another play on the word belonging is that it's be longing for the lack, finding belonging. There's a longing in the being orbiting the lack, if you will. So you're finding being in the orbiting, if you will, like in Dante. And that's very different from, oh, I belong here in a certain stagnant state. And the argument would also be, if belonging in the past was based on something stagnant, then that was, it obviously worked for a lot of people, but it is not actually dealing with the real structure of the human being that's more dialectical, that's more flowing, that's more AB. We don't have AB belonging. That's a new undertaking. And part of the problem is people are responding to the lack of belonging by going back to an AA belonging that leads to all sorts of pathologies and problems. So that's not the way. So you have to have this orbiting structure that's part of it. The issue becomes, and also critically, there's a lot of talk about decentralization. And actually, I saw Dave was replying to how in decentralization, you could still have the logic of capital in operation. There have been many efforts in history to engage in decentralization. The problem is decentralization doesn't necessarily also entail the orbiting. It could just be a decentralization according to a logic of AA belonging, which is going to be probably falling right back into the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talks about, right? There is something about decentralization that is necessary, but it's also erroneous to think it's sufficient. Because what ultimately happens with decentralization is stuff like the American Civil War, slavery, where the states have slaves, or you have, let me put it this way, the moral real always shows up eventually. Because one of those decentralized communities eat meat, and another one of them is vegan, and they think that's murder. And so we got to stop that. No, you can't stop that. It's murder. And the moral real shows up, right? So you need something like decentralization to work against the capital nation state, but it's also erroneous to assume that decentralization is going to deal with all of your problems, because it does until the moral real shows up. And then some people are like, we can't allow them to eat animals. Others say, yes, we can. Oh, and by the way, what are you going to do about nuclear missiles with decentralization? Who's going to run the Navy to deal with the trade routes between the oceans, right? Who's going to deal with this crazy fundamentalist group that has slaves? For women slaves or mutilation? Are you just going to allow that? So you fall back onto the problems of needing a military to stop, say, these horrible decentralized nations doing terrible things. But if you have a military, then you need a government to fund the military, or it needs to be a standing militia. But then you have to convince, who are you going to, the moment you have a militia to stop someone, that automatically fights decentralization. Right? And you want to make sure that doesn't happen again. So decentralization has happened in different forms all throughout history, and it tends to work until the moral real shows up. Now, a unique example is Iona that Karatani talks about, that is very like an island nation that lasted until they were invaded because they didn't have a military. In order to have decentralization, you can't have a military. Then it works, but that means you're completely vulnerable to invasion. But it can work if you don't have a military, because then you don't need to have a state. And you can have something like an anarchist socialism at that point, which seems to actually have some sort of structures, and you tend to have your time energy, but it's like, to allude to like Attack on Titan, it's like Attack on Titan, it works until they come for you. But is that what we want? You have to decide. So you replace, basically what it means is you can deal with the problem of the capital nation state if you, and thus get your time energy if you accept vulnerability. And also your inability to stop moral reals in other decentralized communities. Okay, but that's a very hefty pill for people to swallow in a world where they're going to have the internet showing them what other communities are doing, and where that there are terrorists who could attack you and different things like that. Now, I have a lot more to say, but I'll give it to you quickly on what you were saying, because the next thing to talk about is basically the main structural thrust of the O.G.Rose Belonging Again project is what's called freeing speech, which we talked about at the net the other day, because you have to completely transform the mediums of structure to make people associate being educated and spending your time in an orbiting structure, which is tied to the freeing of speech in the mediums of education. We talked about that a bit at Parallax with the look to the Bear of the Airs, following Neil Postman, following Austin Farrer and different things like that. But let me throw it back to you a little bit on that decentralization. And I should also quickly note, though, that doesn't mean technologies like blockchain, as I've talked about with Michelle Bowens, that may help fight the professional managerial class. No one is saying that doesn't have a function as a technology, and there could be arguments for different currencies to deal with the central bank. Maybe not, it depends. But mostly I'm not targeting Web 3.0 because you have to go into the nitty-gritty of that. But we need to realize that decentralization doesn't solve all your problems willy-nilly, no more than freedom does. Freedom could just be freeing people up to be bored and tortured, right? Decentralization could just be freeing up states to do terrible things, right? So you need something more than that. You need something more to the equation. But let me throw it to you for any response to any of that.
I have a segue to move to the freedom that's delightful. But first, let's talk about the medium hangover that I think we're in, and I think that's from television. I think we are still like, how do you orbit something if one of the necessary elements of the television era is like the couch potato, is like someone that's just sitting there and just getting blasted. There's a movement to this participation that you're talking about with the circling, that I think we're in a sort of Oliver Twist, Tale of Two Cities, like best of times, worst of times, can I have some more, please? It's like this idea of like, there are so many people and so many movements that are going so hard right now. And then there's like people that are going to chiropractors who have dents in their skulls from wearing headsets too much while playing video games. Like both of these things are existing at the same time. Yeah, that's my friend Dr. Anthology about that. And like it's in the balance. It's anyone's guess sort of where it will go. But I think that what is being sought there is a move from this hangover from the television. And there's tons of they're mostly European critics who, when they came to America, were absolutely appalled by our behaviors. But at the same time, it's like there've been so few independent light sources since like the sun and fire and the light bulb. That's what we're drawn to, so once you know that about yourself, but then again, maybe there's a point too where people are too far gone. I know you were talking about zombies and bringing them back to the circus, bringing them around and showing them that live entertainment, just like a little bit of weirdness, can kind of wake them up from their stupor. I want to talk about the freeing of the speech and what you were talking about too with this decentralized. I think we got to go both ways. I don't know how to do that, but I think we have to be both decentralized and some kind of overarching. And I think that brings us to your nightmares of Hegel and Deleuze, because I think that's kind of what it is. It's like this rhizomatic versus the sort of absolute knowing. So how does that weave into?
No, it's exactly right. It goes right into the Hegel Deleuze. And one could say belonging again is one giant wrestling of, say, Platonism, Christianity, Hegel, Nietzsche, costly Deleuze versus cheap Deleuze, all fighting together in one giant battle. And the address emerges, if you will, from this kind of trinity and different things. There is a costly Deleuze that is absolutely invaluable for this problem of overcoming Nash equilibrium in lines of flight, which for me is represented by Simone Weil, which funny enough is kind of actually trying to put, and I spoke with Cadell about this, we're trying to think Deleuze and Plato together, which may sound like the weirdest thing ever. But actually, if the rhizomatic develops according to a formulation, then it's not chaos, and actually it has a unity in the pluralism that occurs, right? And Simone Weil becomes a certain symbol of someone who is Deleuzian, but who doesn't ever join a church. In my opinion, she's very neurodiverse or menti-diverse, but she's also a saint, right? like the logical end of costly delusionism, the one that doesn't avoid social mediation, that engages in lines of flight, doesn't allow themselves to be reducible to epistemologies of representation, but simultaneously also doesn't deny being represented. The logical end of this is beauty. And beauty is a form of lack. And Simone Weil is beautiful. And the key to what's beauty, as I was speaking to Jockin, the more beautiful something becomes, the more particular it becomes. And in that radical particularity, it also becomes mysterious and partial. This is the weird thing. A definitive object is a partial object. You would think it'd be the exact opposite. The more particular something becomes, the more woman moves to Michelle, the more it moves from a definition that's a totality to a definitive Michelle that's particular, beautiful, and thus uncapturable. So the movement to the particular is the key to finding the middle, if you will, between decentralization and union. It has a lot to do with particularity more than decentralization. Beauty at the end of a process of costly deluse that gives you the roots, but the roots are precisely the beauty. Because when you see beautiful things, they're all beautiful, and yet they're all distinct in their particularity. And the argument would be the structure of orbiting increases beauty in those orbiting. And when they orbit, like the planets around the sun, you know, another metaphor that's kind of Deleuzian, that's rhizomatic, is planets orbiting the sun. Are they connected? No. But do they have a certain intelligibility? Yes. Do they have a certain pattern that you could follow? Yes. And yet they're not directly connected. They do not impede upon one another. Now, I know orbits like circles are kind of deterministic. Well, imagine basically a similar thing, but not so deterministic, following ever deeper into a mystery of the beatific vision, right? There would be a logic, there would be a dance, there'd be a decentralization found in a particularity of a shared formulation that was not connected directly, like horizontally, and yet would be connected in that they'd be like birds flying alongside one another, right? So to me, if we think Deleuze with Plato, and then we see that in Simone Weil, and then we see Simone Weil as basically an A-B logic of Hegel, then we start, and then that's all possible because he's ultimately willing to die, vulnerable, Iona. Then we start seeing the model of the subject that seems to be the ability to do this bothness, right? Because you start avoiding the Nash equilibriums. Because the problem is, like, in all honesty, I don't think Deleuze would necessarily support many of these forms of the cheap Deleuzianism that you see that is merely a certain sort of line of flight, lack of intelligibility to other people, and a certain kind of pride in it. He would see that as sacrificing the communal to escape the market. And I don't really know if, I don't think Deleuze would support that. I think what Deleuze understood without, I have an interpretation of game theory that makes me at odds with basically all of the universities, and they would hate me. And I turn to my friend Lorenzo, and I have talked about this, which is the notion that game theory should be the revelation that autonomous rationality doesn't work. But they interpret game theory as the way to make sure we're always rational, because we determine what is the best way to avoid prisoners, dilemmas, et cetera, so forth. Yeah, that might work on the systems level, but the individual is going to experience the choice that gets them out of the dilemma as non-rational. Actually, they're going to experience it as irrational and only later realize it was non-rational, ergo it gave you the best result. So in a sense was supra-rational, but was not rational relative to the variables at the time. But that's all missed because the game theory analysis is thinking on a systems level, not as an individual level. And so then likewise, Deleuze wouldn't have had access to that interpretation of game theory, but I think he was very well aware that the only way to avoid capture was the introduction of different subjectivities. Thus his defense of the schizopolitics, thus the introduction of trying to bring in people rejected by society into the society to change the conditions of possibility of capital. But here's the issue. Not that this is a critique of Deleuze now. If you're going to introduce the neurodiverse to society, the society has to be able to receive the neurodiverse, right? You were saying it was a two-way street earlier. Yes, it is, because if people can't handle it, and likewise, if the neurodiverse also aren't able to communicate enough to relate to, then they may be the variable of mente divergence to escape the Nash equilibrium, but they can't be added to the equation. There's not enough intelligibility for the relation, so they have the resource per se, but they can't be integrated, so they don't help you avoid the Nash equilibria. So you have to have education, society, and community to have that sort of integration. And I would argue, rather than ask, how do you socially spread menti-divergence, it's like, how do we introduce neurodiversity into the society without changing the structure of society to be able to receive it? The issue is the means to go about it. We're not there, but again, no thinker can do everything, right? You know,
well, how would you do that? How would you
frame speech? Yeah, exactly. It's
here's the problem. I think when you're saying that, there's a psychological black hole between the people who want what's best for society and the people who are pursuing power and know how to get it. Those are two different states. I would see what Deleuze is saying as far as like, oh, this might be good overall for society. It might come at a threat or a great cost to the existing power structures. So how would you change the conditions of the society to to the menti-divergent?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I don't mean any of that as a bash on Deleuze, because everyone, you know, has different things that they see and they function, and everyone does their work. And again, back then, they don't have the freaking internet. So like, if they're going to learn other thinkers, they have to go read books. Like, it's really, really important. Like I was saying this with Joel and King Laugh. It's very, very important to not play this game of the church was so stupid back then. Oh, that thinker didn't think of this. They were so dumb. Oh, Dasein can't eat soup sort of thing. You know, yeah, sure. Dasein is unsexed. That's fine. But we really have to, I've talked about it as a kind of gradient with Javier before. Like, all of these thinkers can be colors on the gradient that come together to help us think. I think it's incumbent on us, because of the internet and the technologies, to not say that these thinkers missed something or was stupid or something. No, they did a very important work that now it's our job in a way to try to think together in new ways. So I think it's just really important. I think college and academia has made a long game of like critiquing and bashing old thinkers. I think we should be done with that. Like, I'm not saying it has no role. You only should point out something lacking to the degree that you have a way to address it. Because if you want to say, oh, Deleuze messed up, or he overestimated, or whatever, or maybe he didn't, I don't care how you put it. Okay, well, what is you going to do? And we've really, unfortunately, trained people to think that being a critical thinker means that you're a critic. Being a critic has a role, but there should be more. The key that you have to do is you have to transform the medium of what people associate thinking with as the ability to be open to thoughts that they had never thought before, because otherwise they could not receive the menti-divergent. So the big thing to me is that you have to transform and this would be social, you change every effing classroom from creating the structure that being good at trivia means that you are educated, to a complete conversational structure of education, just like you see on the liminal web and things like that. Because then when you encounter the menti-divergent, you have the space to relate to them, to talk with them, to free speech, to figure things out, not just knowing the answers because you don't know the answers, to create a relationship. You have to, when you introduce menti-diversity or pluralism in general, create spaces where children at a very young age are spending their days in the present, learning about the world, but in a relational context that allows them to get used to or open to the other emotionally, psychologically, and to do that work. Also, conversation is a way to train focus. There's a massive problem with focus today, right? Everyone's focused. You want to know how you can, like, we were talking about how the cell phone destroys focus. If you change the classroom to being primarily conversation-based, oral-based, that right there forces you to train the focus muscle, not merely reading a book, because conversation trains the muscle. So there's something here also with the technology that needs to bring in this ability to hold a train of thought for an extended period of time. The main thing that the classroom does is create, because the main thing is not the content. We learned this from a William Ong, a Marshall McLuhan. It's the incubator, right? The medium. We know that the medium is the message regarding television. We need to think of the medium as the message in school, in the work, in the office. There are thousands of mediums all around us, all the time, that creates associations of what you should do or shouldn't do in this space. The classroom reflects what you should do as work. Know what the boss wants, give them the answer, keep your mouth shut, right? That ethic, that's not merely content, that's an ethic. That's a way of living that is closed. They don't want you open. You're closed to focus on the task you're given if you do it without thinking, because you're actually not supposed to think about what you thought about the American Revolution. You're supposed to answer these questions that are given to you so that you win the trivia game, right? So gradually over 18 years and for the rest of your life, you actually associate being educated and rational as a single track and not really, here's the key, here's the real key. Your education in the classroom actually theoretically would not need anyone else around you. If you were the only person in the classroom, that would be the same education as if there were 30 people in the classroom, right? So the people there are not essential to the education you are engaging in. In fact, they could be a liability to it because they could distract you or they could be rowdy or different things, right? What you need to do is make the other essential to learning. The presence of the other person is the only way to solve these problems. And actually, that would maybe make the mentally divergent or the neurodiverse necessary because you're stuck in a Nash equilibrium and can't think these things through. The person, the minority, suddenly the minority is who you need. You're trained to think to keep them out. Well, actually, you can't solve the problems without them. You have to create an education system that creates the incubation of problem solving with a group. And the more diverse it is as a collective intelligence, the higher the probability that you can solve the problems. Because here's the funny thing. Right now, we are trying to push diversity into people on a kind of moral plane. You ought to do it or you're a bigot. You can actually show, and Lorenzo does good work on this, that collective intelligence is far more effective when you introduce diversity into it. And so diversity becomes a means of avoiding Nash equilibria. So then you make everyone happy in the liberal world who wants diversity. Yeah, but it's the diversity is on grounds of a relation, not from a sort of do it or you're a bigot, but a ground of relation that opens up ways of thinking that otherwise you could not, and that would be Deleuze, right? Because Deleuze is kind of pushing for a diversity, but in a way it's a deeper diversity because it's a mentality, not just a skin color or a way of talking or a culture. He wants a diversity all the way down to ways of thinking, right? Well, we then have to be in a classroom that introduces us and warms us up to the ability to relate to people who have different ways of thinking on a very essential level, right? This will never happen if the classroom continues to be a structure of trivia, right? So you have to change that. You have to also create basically continual opportunities of sort of exchanges like you and I are doing right now on the liminal web on a global scale between many nations. And again, I'll note a few more things. Everyone knows in what is one of the number one things that causes geopolitical crises? Shutting down communication. When different nations won't talk to one another, right? When they don't know how to relate to one another. What stopped the Cuban Missile Crisis or say with Reagan from blowing up Russia? They got on the phone. They talked with one another, Kennedy, right? Communication is a big deal. Diplomacy has been, like nations don't do diplomacy anymore. This is a massive, massive, massive cause of geopolitical risk, right? Economically, Dietrich McCloskey makes an incredible case that enrichment, the great enrichment was due with the unleashing of rhetoric, right? And likewise, what makes people who hate one another tend to not hate each other so much when they meet face to face and talk? You get the KKK member who secretly, you introduce them to someone of a minority. Suddenly they go, oh, I guess minorities aren't so bad after all. Opening periods of unveiling gradual relationship has massive impact on the geopolitical, the economic, and the social. I would also argue that basically if you go through history, the greatest way for people to learn is through oratory methods versus worksheets. You do all of this, you've created the fertile ground to receive the menti-divergent, to receive the neurodiverse, just like Deleuze understood. And this also then collectively creates a multi-variable intelligence that is clearly distinct from AI. And also would be able to probably use AI in a manner that does not efface humanity, but is actually able to think about ways to use it as a tool to enhance the accomplishments of that neurodiverse collective intelligence that would be socially associated with and suggested by transforming it on all those different levels. There's more to say, but those would be a few things I would start with.
I would say we have to give each class room to speak, right? A lot of what's going on is there's not any kind of meaningful transmission of information between classes. Like all the things you're talking about, those schools exist in America. Just about 1,000 people go to them, and they all become presidents and hedge fund managers and all this. Like it's not that they're non-existent.
Yeah.
It's that the public school is like one of the greatest own goals ever conceived. And there's a small difference between those privileged enough to go to private school. But then there's really like what you're talking about, this focus on rhetoric, this focus on oration, this focus on listening, and really understanding the essential nature of everyone around you. Then I think what happens is in the whatever post-capital neoliberal global environment we're in is that the rich talk to the rich, and they miss out on some innovation. And so there is much more manufactured demand, which leads to kind of downstream consequences from people trying to emulate things that have no cultural grounding. And it's just like this sort of endless chase. It reminds me of McGowan's new book that he came out with like both the capitalist and the consumer knows that the product they're jonesing for is not gonna do anything but like a kid on Christmas. By the afternoon they're done with it. And so like I think this is one of the questions is and especially with people just beginning with theory, with philosophy, with circling the void, how do you not make them feel like lesser when they just get started? I think that's like, I think poor people feel lesser. The rich will be like, oh, there's a bunch of speech codes, there's a bunch of barriers to entry and stuff like this, versus a more like welcoming and like stewarding, more people to come to the feast. Even like especially knowing that they probably are going to have a perspective that saves you from Nash equilibria, and like how to kind of welcome and engender those energies. I think it's a very interesting question.
I think it's a tremendous question. So a few things come to mind. First, for me, it's very important that belonging, again, when it talks about the address, must refer to things that have already happened or already exist, or otherwise it's not thinking the now, and it's kind of imagining something that if we only all did this, then everything would be good. And history is a long story of showing that if you do that, you get a lot of trouble. And this is, I think, some of the brilliance of Hegel, is Hegel's always looking to history. Like, what are the episodes we've seen? That's why someone like a Dietrich McCloskey compared with a Carl Fournier, these things, or Marx, these things are very important, because it is episodes in history that have occurred. Now, maybe they're misunderstood. Maybe there's like bias in the account. So you have to kind of find the presupposition-less or more presupposition-less finding in these episodes to begin to think, okay, what would the address look like, right? Like we know, like you said, that there have been forms of education that are rhetoric-based, that are oratory-based, and when they teach science, for example, it's tied to the rhetoric medium, not the test medium. It's tied to the problem solving in the lab with people, and maybe you have to travel to a different lab, thus get diversity that way, travel to find people who know the answers, and maybe you have like a 10-year project that you're working on that's always like negotiating labs. Maybe you have to think about different ways to convince people to help you with things. There's an entrepreneurial tied to this as well. All of these things get tied together. There's, people talk about the aristocratic education, the tutor model. These things have a basis in reality. They are not based on, and we see what they tend to occur, and we have good reason to think that these things can work, and that it is not merely an IQ-based thing, because this is also important. The moment you say you need a certain IQ to do it, you're in trouble. The moment you say you need a certain evolved consciousness to do it, you're in trouble, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have to, and also if you need a certain amount of money, you're in trouble, right? you have to be finding something that is radically non-contingent, which of course automatically reduces the field quite a bit to what it could possibly be or different. What's that, Philip? Please.
Unless there's a technology, right?
Yes.
Because like this is I think this is Stein's whole point. Like one of the sort of unifying factor of world-class mathematicians is they had a world-class mathematician that was one of their teachers.
Yes.
And so is it possible that somewhere on YouTube you could get a world-class education? Somewhere from AI you could get a world-class tutor.
Yes.
What is, kind of keeping us from moving in that direction, outside of lack of, I don't know, profitability, maybe? I'm not sure what.
No, basically that's right. So the other thing that's advantageous, why it's very important for me not to throw out technology, is because technology has a tendency to come down in cost. Like it tends to spread. Dietrich McCloskey talks about that. Like most people on planet Earth, regardless of their class, has plumbing. Well, that was not always the case in human history. And obviously, I'm not talking about everyone in human history. Most people now have air conditioning or electricity, right? You can always make exceptions. No one's saying everyone, right? Technology has a tendency to spread because it reduces costs and it becomes much more egalitarian. Now, money doesn't. If you're talking about money, that's different. But if you're talking about technology, it tends to have a certain spreadability over, not all at once. It tends to take 10 years or 20 years or longer. I think it's speeding up now because of market forces and creative destruction and so on and so forth. But Zoom is something of a certain cost. The internet, most people have the internet. You're getting faster internet. This is something of, there is a cost, obviously, but it's not a radical cost. It's not a stupidly high cost. Well, that has democratic potential, if you will. That has egalitarian possibility if you use the technology in the non-dopamine way when all the forces on planet Earth are trying to make you use them in the capturable way, right? I think what you were saying is extremely important. I would argue that you can get an education on YouTube that is the highest in the history of the world. I don't think you can get, like, do we really think that Harvard has a better education than what you can get on YouTube? No, it doesn't. Now, you have to know what channels to go to. That's the catch. There's still an information sorting problem, right? If you knew where to go, what classes to go to, what professors to listen to, what academics or whatever, then you can get an education. Oh, and by the way, you can do it on your time when you're available, and you could theoretically do it till the day you die. You are going to have people, in my opinion, when they're 70 in 2040, if we don't all blow up by then, who will have levels of education that have not been seen in human history, simply because of the access to information. Now, maybe it's going to be a kind of radical inequality where some people are just insane and everyone else is dopamine addicted. That's always, of course, a possibility. And unfortunately, human history tends to be a story where that tends to occur. So hopefully it won't. But this is the point. That's what inequalities, rather economic or social or intellectual or whatever, those do tend to be what to occur. The genius of capitalism, if you will, was that at least at the beginning, it could be non-zero sum in terms of the technology, not the money. This is something Dietrich McCloskey is big on. That's why she goes after Piketty. She thinks Piketty made a big mistake because Piketty says, well, look here, capital and assets tend to be restricted as wages go down. She's like, that can occur. Now, she wants to say this has a lot to do with bad government policy, central planning, and the Federal Reserve and whatever. That all aside, the point she wants to make is, sure, but technology is what makes you wealthy. Air conditioning, internet, not money. Now, I think this is where I have to have a very long discussion between McCloskey, Planier, and Marx and all that. Say, okay, well, that's true. Technology makes us wealthy, but what if we're unembedded, anxious, mental health is destroyed, and don't have time, energy, right? So there's all the McCloskey. It's always difficult. It's like Deleuze. It's true. The great enrichment is there, but there's the unembeddedness as well. And there's the lack of time, energy. And there's something that's accelerating us to death in the Virilio sense. So we have to think those all together. So that all said, without me going down that rabbit hole, because there's a lot to be said on that. But if you grant it to me that technology is central here, and we know this, then what we have to be intentional about is making sure that the people who use the internet or Zoom to become these orbiting subjects or children, the book just says Nietzsche and children, absolute knowers, we have to make sure that it doesn't become a minority that are way here while the majority are in dopamine land. Because if that's the case, dopamine land, if you will, because if that's the case, geopolitically we'll collapse. You know, we're going to basically, Lorenzo said this like 10 years ago, and I think he's correct. Basically, the world is going to become a whole lot of small fascist states. That's what's going to occur. Or AI is going to force the world together, and it will be a terrible form of nudging, if not direct oppression. Or Amish. The world is just going to be split apart. The world is going to be split into a bunch of Duginism, small fascist states, although fascism and Dugin, I shouldn't put them together, but I think practically it ends up there. I have to make that argument in the book. Or you end up Japan, Amish, techno human transhumanism. The world's just going to split between those four options, and we'll see what occurs. But if we know we don't want that, well, then we have to be intentional now about the incubator of the subjects that we're getting. And that's where you absolutely have to make the average classroom focused on putting children in a rhetorical context where when they receive instruction, because usually with rhetoric, like it should be noted, there's still going to be some degree of bestowing. There's going to be a teacher. There is going to be a lecture, but then you talk about it. Like everyone on these liminal webs have read books, they've listened to lectures, but when they come, but the discussion, that's why the discussion is able to be what it is. So you're going to still have some learning, but it's not going to be learning for the output of education is not going to be a freaking test. The output becomes conversation. That's the key. What is the output of education today, or the business? It's a product, or it is a test. You have to change what people associate the output of learning to be. Because if they associate that with getting grades or getting marks, then they tend to gamify the system to get those marks, or they formulate their consciousness around getting those marks, right? So the output becomes conversation, relatability, and problem solving, or thinking through giant problems like everyone on the liminal web is, and people see the output of education as an orbiting. If you're doing education correctly, you're continually orbiting. You're never finished. You're just getting closer to the thing that you're orbiting. And as you get closer, you change the subjectivity. So the output of education becomes an orbit structure, which is rhetoric based, as we see on the liminal web. And so you can have lectures, but guess what the lectures are? You don't have to worry about why in the world right now you have a problem of finding teachers, right? You have a quality teachers that you give to the kids. YouTube deals with that right there. We can solve that real quick. And everyone on planet Earth can learn about foreign affairs from Corkin or different people like that, and receive the education and then discuss the matter. So YouTube also, here's the crazy thing that means YouTube could do, or these different technologies, or however you want to do it. It would radically reduce costs for an incredibly high-level education for everyone on freaking planet Earth, and then logistically deal with all of those problems, and then free people to a form of education that is far higher, radically increasing the probability of the average person's subjectivity transforming in a manner that could orbit in the lack, as we've described, that would then also have positive geopolitical diplomacy consequences. It would create more drive, because what do we learn in Lacan? Speech and desire go together, right? So if people learn intercourse, sex is like speaking, right? So if people come to be habituated to speaking, well, that's going to work on their desires. And it's probably going to move them toward drive, because the output is drive, which is the continual incompleteness of the orbiting, right? So that's the I prefer not to revolution that Zizek says, that becomes a certain transformation of the subjectivity in the middle of capital that transforms everyone from consuming all the time to creating environments of sustainability for that orbiting. And then I would argue that kind of speaking is how you transform the dusting of the other into an apathetic core that makes the Negentropic breadboard. So you transform the energy of people, habituate them to environments of doing that, which I would argue will also create wealth for the economy, because I would argue that environment greatly increases the probability of innovation, creativity, as we learned from Dietrich Mikowski, and then the probability of, say, finding solutions to global warming or economic stagnation or different things increases dramatically. And then you also have, like, people would say, oh, that's why we're educated, to solve these problems. Like the whole metacrisis screams of an education that doesn't exist to solve problems. How did this happen? Because the average person is associated, they're not educated to think about solving problems. They're plugging into a system that creates a nasty equilibrium. You transform what people associate the output with, stuff like the metacrisis or the meaning crisis. These things then are approached by the educated subject because they see these things as what they're educated to deal with, versus right now they're educated to ignore them. Put your head down and go back to work. Don't worry about these big things, right? We are educated to ignore the metacrisis, not to see that as, oh, that's what we were educated to deal with. I know about that. That's the entire environment. That's the whole point. You're not supposed to be educated to get a job. You're supposed to be educated to figure out how to deal with things like the metacrisis. That's why you're educated, and how to relate to people in your community as subjects to be negentropic or to be subjects that can handle negativity. You're being educated to handle diversity. You're being educated to be open to the other. You're being educated to be your own self-turning wheel, not to get a job. If you become a self-turning wheel that can deal with global pluralism, you'll also get a job, because the amount of value you create is insane, right? Like, that's the other irony. We've educated people to get jobs and made them less valuable on the job site, and also less happy, actually. And so the irony is, if you educate people correctly, they're a lot more valuable, they have a lot more use on the job, and they're happy to be there because they have value in the thing that they themselves have created their subjectivity to enjoy, as opposed to be alienated by. So you can get your cake and eat it too. I said a lot, I'll give it back to you, but there are a lot. And then I need to talk about why the philosopher is very important in this, because they have a role of questioning presuppositions to keep the talk going in a kind of Heideggerian sense. So, but let me give it to you for any response.
I think that's what is being educated. What is being educated is desire and demand, specifically within market dynamics. Like, I took the LSAT. While I was taking the test, I was like, this feels like a Myers-Briggs. Like, it feels like a personality test. Like, they're weeding out people that just won't question anything structurally. I mean, there are important things, but I basically stand by Shakespeare, what Shakespeare said about lawyers. And so the idea is like a different type of selfhood with different desires and demands comes from an education. And if you want to talk about AI taking like everyone's jobs, like, people could become teachers. There could be 10x the amount of teachers. And like, if you want to spend time with your kid and your job, you know, I don't know, as an accountant went away, like, I could very easily see there being like small groups, like maybe 5 kids, and then the adult is like, oh, maybe I don't know all that much. You put on the YouTube video, and then you just kind of like hold space for conversation. You probably direct things a little bit. And if you don't like know about it, you could just go home and learn about it. Like, what we're in is the age of learning and unlearning, more than I think like literacy or non-literacy. It's like, how quickly can you be like, oh, I learned a bunch of stuff that has nothing to do with anything. I'm going to let it go. And I'm going to learn this new stuff that is now relevant, even though I know it probably will be irrelevant before the end of my life, but that's okay, because I'll have learned how to unlearn and learn, so I can unlearn what I learned. And now I'm, you know, in this place where there's less of a gap between generations of what the adults say and what they do. And the closer that comes together, the more trust kids have. And they can also find exemplars, you know, and be like, oh, wow, like, you know, people are saying we got crises with dads or whatever. And it's like, no, my dad's actually like dope, you know, and a lot of that does have to do with the amount of technology that has come online recently, which probably isn't going to be as big of a chasm between us and our kiddos. But yeah, I think that is like a giant opportunity in the education with technology, and I'm very excited about
that. Again, you know, the owl of Nineveh flies at dusk, right? Flying is great. Dusk might be difficult, but we have to realize that, again, as we know, catastrophe in Asia is also opportunity, right? So the meta crisis could be the meta hope or something, you know, the meta opportunity, if we will. It's just that the brain is naturally on the side of understanding one-sidedness from Hegel, and thus seems to only see one-sidedness of crisis, not as opportunity. I think, like what we're saying, the opportunity for the average person on this planet. So if it is true that from history and from global politics and all these different things, that the mere act of two people speaking is at the very ground, it is the ultimate state of nature, not like Rousseau or Hobbes, like the actual historic episode that seems to make an insane difference is relation. Two people, different relation. Talking, okay? All right, that's foundational. Not person learning facts, reciting on a test, but two people meeting and relating. What would it mean to have an entire socioeconomic system around that, figuring out how to enable people to relate? Now, there's a bunch of paradoxical moves here, though, because as the book will argue, the central beginning of Belonging Again 2.1 is the question of how does anyone leave Plato's cave on their own without being dragged, because the story is actually someone being dragged out. And the argument of the book is that we've never actually addressed this problem of how anyone would leave the cave if nobody dragged you out. We tend to misremember the narrative as someone leaving on their own in order to convince ourselves we've addressed the problem when we never have, okay? So there's a certain issue of subjectivity that has never been addressed that must be addressed that sounds individualistic, but it is actually a focus on the interior state of the individual for the sake of the relation. So there's a bunch
Can I ask a really dumb question real quick?
No, please.
Okay, who dragged the person out though? Was it someone who left by themselves?
The philosopher, no, that's exactly right. You know, Plato and Socrates, Socrates basically says, I did, we did, right?
Oh,
like
okay.
we dragged them out. But then, of course, the question is, who dragged Plato out? Who dragged Socrates out, right? There's an eternal regression. This has never been addressed. And so what we end up with in the West, in my opinion, is a very confused mixture of you need a teacher, but rugged individual. Okay, we can leave the cave on our own, but then we need philosophers to teach us how to leave on. So we're really confused. Like it's a big ambiguous mess because we've never focused in on this problem of how would you leave the cave if nobody came for you? Is that even possible or is that impossible, right? This must be addressed, which is a core question of a kind of left individual, if you will, that actually, if you think about, helps the individual turn on themselves internally to see a lack that actually can then function as a basis of relation that isn't individualistic. A bunch that I just said, but by focusing on this narrative, we can rethink the individual to actually be capable of engaging in relation in a non-parasitic or needy way, right? Because the danger is here, if you talk about relations as central, people go, well, of course, I've got friends and different things. It's like, yeah, but most of these relations are not the deep relations. They're shallow, and they also tend to be needy and parasitical in a way people avoid themselves, right? So we can't talk about that. So you have to do work on the individual subject to make the most negentropically of the relation. So there's a bunch of paradoxical moves, but if you grant me all of that, which hopefully Belonging Again covers, then what we're saying is, okay, we've got to think about the individual decentralization in the context of a relation of pluralism, a pluralistic relation. Therefore, it's not tribal. That's the other problem. If you overly emphasize relation, okay, well, is it relations between Nazis or relations between Nazis and Jews or Nazis and communists, right? That's a whole different ballgame. Vegans and non-vegans, right? That's really difficult. Yeah, but that's where all the negentropy is. The negentropy, to be very general, the negentropy the amount of negentropy you can get for the system is relative to the amount of pluralism you can put in relation without it killing one another. Like magnets that you hold together that are pulling apart, the longer you can hold the magnets together that are pushing against, the more energy you create, right? So the negentropy, that the usable energy for the system is contingent about the amount of pluralism, the intensity of the pluralism that you can make relate, which also increases the neurodiversity or meta-divergency of the collective consciousness that helps you deal with things like the metacrisis and avoid Nash equilibriums globally. Okay, so then the entire education system is about how do you bring people, how do you increase the probability that the average person on planet Earth can relate to difference? That, and note here also, relation, you know how earlier you said, and we were talking about with beauty and all that, it's a blending of decentralization and unity. So relation is the unity, difference is the decentralization, relating with diversity. You have to get all of that all together, right? That is the model that is Negentropic, that's really effing hard. And the only way you would do it is if you train the subject to actually basically associate that with what they ought to do, because that's what the classroom and its medium suggests. That's what the society suggests. And the oughtness is not a product of a vague, non-contingent moral ought that comes down from on high, but comes down from the negative pragmatism of the negentropy that thus emerges, and the result of the ability to deal with things like the metacrisis and things like that. But you would have to, and the thing with it, all of this becomes much more likely thanks to things like the internet and YouTube and these technologies that allows people, like right now, you could theoretically get on this Zoom and talk with people in China, or different nations, or different ethnicities. The amount of pluralism you could expose yourself to with Zoom is incredibly high, right? Whereas before you would have to travel there, right? Likewise, encountering people to have philosophical discussions on things you disagree with, or to talk about, or to think through real problems like how in the world would you create an alternative energy? There, you could theoretically have 10,000 people on the same call, right? You know, there's always the problem of classroom size. Wouldn't necessarily have to deal with that. And what if you had some kids that like to study at 10 at night versus 7 in the morning? Wouldn't have to worry about that. What if also you have this problem where all the kids don't sleep enough? Well, that sure as heck doesn't help. Well, we wouldn't have to get up at 7 a.m. to send the kids to school before the parents go to work, right? There are all of these logistical structural problems that you would deal with. And then also, if you do have school, like a lived place you could go to, it doesn't have to be the classroom. It can be something like getting together, like with Philosophy Portal, or coming together for football, or coming together in the diner. It doesn't have to be this crazy coming together in a physical location, because you would still want to do that. Heck, maybe the community would have a role again, because the community is where the kids come together to meet one another, as opposed to coming together sitting in rows of desks. That's a kind of torture zone or something like that. Well, now I'm being mean. But all of this would suggest that the key is the creation of the environment, right? Like Michelle and I with the kids, like when we think about homeschooling, we don't think about having school at home. We think about making the home an incubator for an association of learning as a way of life, right? So you're creating an environment for just, oh yeah, learning is what you do, but that means the parents have to read as well, because if you say you should read and you're never reading, they're just going to associate that as something you don't want to do. You have to make learning just simply what you do, which means it just has to simply be what the parents do. It has to be what the kids see. It has to be what they just do. And the thing is, if you do all that, the probability that a kid just goes about solving problems or creating things or thinking through issues they don't know about or being interested in books skyrockets. And if theoretically, I think it's basically impossible for everyone on planet Earth to read every book or to solve every problem. And of course, when you solve problems, there's always more problems, as we learned from Hegel. Then we don't have to worry about this ever exhausting itself, because the very creativity of human beings and their drive then creates new problems to solve and to work through that they are then excited to solve. Like, let's take space travel. Everyone's talking about that. Can you imagine all of the things that would be to do if you took space travel seriously? Right now, basically, everyone is like, that's ridiculous. Let's not even worry about it. And I'm extremely sympathetic to it. But you see, that's under an educational context where people don't want to solve problems. If you had a world as a collective consciousness that associated things like that with stuff we could do or new energy sources, then why not? The problem is right now, like, imagination is profoundly restricted, and practical creative problem solving is radically restricted by the associations that people have to use education, right? Like, well, none of that necessarily follows. If the future is entirely open, as Hegel talks about, and a contingent to say, well, then all of these things are possible. There's no telling what kind of music you could use. And you could use AI as a tool to do these things that AI would never imagine doing, but we as human beings could imagine doing, because we have been habituated to use our free time in a manner to negentropically think of these possibilities. So it becomes a kind of form maker versus a replacer, an extender of humanity versus a replacer of humanity. But there is no need, like, and then I'll give it back to you. It is very clear that the technology we have right now could give rise to a sociological address. It's not a we need to make or we need to do. All we need to do, in my opinion, is you remove the college monopoly on credentials, where you don't have to go to college to get a job. You can just get employment testing, so then anyone could prove their worth. You remove the trivia structure of education, and you associate it with a rhetorical structure. You use YouTube and the education models that you find there to educate different people and things like that. You start moving to kind of emphasizing that the economy is based on a dialectic between creativity and energy, which is kind of, for me, the meta way to think about time energy for Dave. And have at it, kids. You create that environment, you start to profoundly transform what people associate being educated with, and it transforms their motivation. And then it goes from there. And then also, like, from a structural standpoint, if the government would like to spend a lot of money to make, like, let's say the government spent $500 billion to make sure every American had high-speed internet that could use Zoom, that would be a wonderful investment. That would be an example not of what, I talk about cone dynamics versus spiral dynamics, which, the cone is the infrastructure, the material condition. If the government would like to spend money, and the globe would like to spend money to increase the medium, not the material, the medium of Zoom and the internet and so forth, to increase the probability that people have access to this information technology, then that would be a wonderful infrastructure investment, because Keynes shows that when the state actually spends on infrastructure, it tends to pay for itself by the multiplier effect, right? There's a difference between the government spending money on, say, research on squirrels, and the government building a highway, right? One of the problems we have right now is the government is basically building infrastructure by replacing pre-existing infrastructure or doing new roads. If you really want a money multiplier effect, which for Keynes is actually an investment multiplier effect, not a money multiplier effect, a really good investment would be investing in a medium condition to have people have access to these kind of technologies and to provide all of those different things, because the amount of wealth that would probably be created by the government making that investment would easily pay for itself, and also create who knows what kind of wealth, because you tend to create wealth through creativity versus just stimulate wealth, which government spending and liquidity increase. So I would be all about the creation of infrastructure and the investment of communities to create places of meeting in the real life. You could easily have communities basically build Friday football arenas, diners and different things, places where people can meet, and the creation of, say, access to the internet. These are spending programs that are very doable and not expensive compared to what the government would be willing to do. But then also you could argue, let's say you're more libertarian, you don't want the government to do that. That's fine. The technology will probably naturally spread. We just as subjects need to know that that's what we need to use it for. And in fact, if you wanted to maybe accelerate it from a governmental level, if the government began actually spending to create this infrastructure and then publicly message that they were doing so that people could use the internet for education and Zoom conversations with pluralism and having these different conversations, and then financing, say, philosophers or different liminal web people who are able to host those conversations in a manner that keeps them flowing. This would probably be government spending that is more on the FDR side as an investment multiplier that shows to work, versus the money multiplier side that tends to be on the central banking side that doesn't seem to work so well. Because that's the problem. There are differences between investment multipliers and money multipliers. Or inflation, which is a form of stimulus. We always got to keep that in mind. That does not seem to pay for itself and tends to lead to either So another thing I'm saying a lot is that we haven't done a very good job that there are different types of government spending. Like, there is government spending that has an investment multiplier that tends to pay for itself, but we haven't really had a lot of successful investment multipliers for a very long time. It tends to be on the side of money multiplying, which actually just tends to create inflation, tends to make assets go up and create wealth inequality. So the current ways that the government tries to stimulate the economy tends to contribute to what Piketty talks about. So that's not very good. But if we're talking about an investment multiplier, and here's the other key, an investment multiplier, I think it's quite clear in its effectiveness, is tied to technology. If you invest to build roads, it is not clear that this necessarily creates wealth to pay for itself. It has to be the investment in a new technology. or a new infrastructure. This is very important because when FDR was around and they're building roads to cities that do not have roads, it is obviously an upgrade, right? Because they don't have the highway. But if you build a second highway to the same city now, the probability of this investment multiplier being successful is far, far less, right? Likewise, if you build internet for people who do not have internet, the probability that this is a multiplier, an investment multiplier, is quite high. But if you simply say send them checks and hope they spend it on something, maybe not. Maybe so. It would depend on the particular motivation of people. If you send everyone UBI and they are educated in the way that we are describing, they would probably invest it in their own creation of drive that would create wealth creation. So sending out UBI to subjects that have been trained to orbit would probably be quite successful. But sending out UBI to people who have not been trained to orbit probably would not be so successful, actually. So all of those, the questions of government spending are profoundly tied to, are we talking technology and what kind of subjects have we incubated? Because there's a fundamental incompleteness in economic theory, which is the character and quality of the subject that is being invested in, that I think has been overlooked. Because we've just said, hey, the subject's a rational actor, so we can't calculate that. My argument is that government investment as such that I have described is contingent on the quality of the subject that the investment is to and for. But that has not been thought in economic theory because we basically thought of a fairly flat subject. So if you change the character of the subject, the effectiveness of the spending as investment is probably far higher on a multiplier effect. But let me give it back to you.
Well, and as far as the governmental spending is a very interesting topic. There is also something with publicly funded R&D that's then privately capitalized on. And that generally does go to, I mean, this is one of the things that's like hard to talk about. It generally does go to very dynamic subjects, very dynamic personalities that, you know, have innovative thoughts, know how to raise VC and like get things done, you know, which is yeah, it's a very, very good question, but I think I mean, it's very good. You're absolutely right with the caps we're putting on ourselves for collective imagination. And it's not clear to me that giving people more access to the internet, just like UBI, would necessarily mean that our collective imagination would go up. So these things have a lot has to happen kind of simultaneously.
Yes.
Kind of quickly.
Yes.
And I think like what you were talking about with the development of the subject, that's like a super interesting question to me, because it's like, well, okay, why aren't people choosing to develop themselves? If they're not, how do you get them to? If you can't get them to, what do you do? Force them? And then it's like, are we only going to give resources to people once they prove that they're like somehow worthy of them? That's a little dicey too. So how I guess my question is, how do you use all of these technologies to create some kind of measure, some kind of way of measuring, oh yeah, we're actually becoming better problem solvers, rather than what I think is happening now is I think we're quite self-deceptive. We're like, oh yeah, look at all these problems, you know, we can solve, and then completely, you know, and we can solve a lot more than we used to be able to, but there have also been a lot more that have been created along the way. So how do you kind of balance those two?
Excellent question. So first off, it should be noted that to be a realist, historically speaking, unfortunately, significant paradigmatic shifts don't tend to occur until there's a forcing function, like a world war or a solar flare or a massive economic downturn. Like if you look at a book, like I was speaking with Bowens, the great Michelle Bowens, on kind of global cycle history going back thousands upon thousands of years, it tends to be that you have a world order, fall apart, World War I, then New World Order, fall apart, Bretton Woods, then it starts reading an entropic state of a totality and it collapses. So, there's a few things. One, there's the question of how do things change historically, and it tends to be a forcing function, where basically you have no choice, because there's two questions. How do you do all of this with a forcing function, and how do you do all this without a forcing function? Do you understand what I'm saying? Now, with a forcing function, it tends to work like this, following Faithful Presence and all these other books, Randall Collins. You have a bunch of people, let's just say the liminal web, who are doing whatever weird stuff it is that we do that is different, that is basically ignored, but just keeps the faithful work that when the forcing function occurs, then you have, say, 10% of people on the planet, not the majority, 10%, then to come to it and say, wow, this is alternative. Well, 10% is built, that's 800 million people. That's an unbelievable amount of people. And then if you get that 10% that is forced to consider the alternative way of thinking, then that 10% begins to spread and it begins to work through that, right? So that's the forcing function model. Now, the question is, are we in a world now with nukes and great complexity that can't do a forcing function, because then it would be too late, right? So forcing function model, we just keep doing our thing, blah, 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 right? Because I definitely think the liminal web, if we use that as a catchphrase, is basically the introduction of a form of education required by the subject to handle global pluralism in a manner that doesn't fall back onto naive forms of belonging and meaning, and various geopolitical responses that are very dicey and risky, so on and so forth. So I think, I have to make that argument, but I believe it is the case. All right. So you have where the forcing function brings it, or there's a question of, well, how could you stimulate it? What I think you would basically have to do is you'd have to reverse the Supreme Court ruling in the 1970s against employment testing. I think you would have to, like I said, break up the college monopoly on credentials. I think you would have to have government investment to spread the conditions of the internet, because like you said something very, very important. Most government spending goes to dynamic people, right? And can you blame the government? I mean, really? I mean, they want their money to invest, right? But the problem is then you get corporatism. Oh, the other big one is you have to reform intellectual property rights, which right now is a disaster. And what that would mean is if you cannot get intellectual property of something you don't create, you can't be in intellectual ventures. I think also we have to rethink citation structures. Like right now, I do think plagiarism is being used to silent dissonant voices. There's plagiarism hunters. You have to rework intellectual property rights as well, not to remove intellectual property rights, but to create structures where if you're going to create something, you have to actually create it, and the ownership is going to be based on the actual product, not the idea. Because then what's happening now is people are just waiting for somebody to invent something, then they sue them because they have the intellectual product and they've never done this. And companies like Apple are actually quite disastrous on this. I think that's a problem. I think you also, basically following Jonathan Rauch, you must basically remove K Street and lobbying and special interest groups. I think there are governmental structures that have to be taken into account. I think Maurice Olson's book on the rise and fall of nations also shows you that the special interest groups basically make it impossible for government money to not lead to inflation that then benefits the asset class. Because this is the trick. The state right now, following Keynes, and to Keynes's defense, he was very clear that he was talking about an investment multiplier, not a money multiplier. This distinction, in my opinion, has been completely lost in economic thinking and has been a disaster. Investment multipliers would require basically doing away with special interest groups or really working on government spending in those structures. That then is a very technical matter, though, where you have to go through the particulars of that in the jurisprudence and so on. So forgive me if I don't go into further detail, but that's another factor that you would have to get into all this.
What about stock buybacks?
The equity markets in general, I'm not sure about stock. Here's the problem. People may say that they don't like stock buybacks, but most of them have Roth IRAs and retirement funds that are based on these heavily weighted companies that do the majority of stock buybacks, that if they stop, they would lose their equity value. So you also have an issue of the retirement structures that people have that, like, let's say you say stock buybacks are bad because it overweights a company and different things. Well, yeah, but you're actually not just taking on the company, you're taking on the entire elderly population that is benefiting from that structure of the equity market. So we definitely have to think about the equity market. We definitely have to think also about retirement funds that are based on a growing market versus perhaps dividends or royalties from inventions. Like what if paying for a retirement was tied to inventing something that got royalties more so than investing in corporations? Because right now people can say all day long they don't like giant corporations. The retirement structure is a form of preserving it. They are not going to turn again corporate. They may complain about it forever. It's not changing until you transform retirement and the way that people finance later on in life. But then there are arguments to be made. So that's a great question that gets into all of that. What's that, Philip?
Well, it's yeah. I mean, it's even almost on a like a more radical, deeper level, just interest as such.
Mm.
You know, like this is something where so like what you're saying, there's so many people bought into the system, and like it doesn't work if you can't make interest on
Yeah,
on money.
yeah.
It's like this deadlock,
Yeah.
really, because you could say the people that do have access to certain levels of compounding interest will run the show.
Mm.
And they're basically all of that is codified into law to maximize shareholder profits. And so how to, kind of get people to buy into something other than their dopamine while they're like, hey, what about all those people over there? They're just hitting the button like crazy. I'm gonna be like them. Like, why can't I do that? And then people will advertise to them. So a lot of it has to do with getting on, different types of timelines to say, okay, I know like short term, this might not be great. Like the first 300, I mean, honestly, probably the first 10,000 pages of Lacan, I was like, what is this guy talking about? And then just like sticking with it, where like this girl I was dating read 2 pages of Hannah Arendt, was like, I don't get it, I'm done. And it's like, oh, what? She's like, no, I'm like really smart. Like I got a 35 on my ACT. Like this stuff, I don't see any point reading this. It makes no sense. And you're like, oh, all right, so what are you gonna read? And it's like Taylor Swift news. And you're like, okay, well. It's like I don't know. It's so multivariate.
Well, there's a few things. So basically, the name of the game is to increase as much activity as possible without generating chaos, because that's how you get Negentropic. So, for example, I would have to really elaborate this, and it's something much later on in Belonging Again that I'm personally not settled on. So anything I say next, I'm not actually 100% sure on. But I've been thinking a lot about passive income structures and how they're a massive cause of this problem. Is because, like, I'm not sure if, but then the question is the following. Do you set limits on passive income, or do you increase the amount of creative destruction in the market to then make passive income a risky investment strategy? Because please.
On some level, you set limits on the amount of basic necessities that can be used as appreciating assets.
Oh, sure.
I don't know how to set that limit, but
well,
like, you can't just have a lawyer go and buy houses for you that are 50% their valuation, and put 10 on $5,000 retainers.
Yes.
So that you can go from 150 to 175 million net worth in 1 year.
Yep.
Without ever seeing a single house, even knowing that you have them. I mean, this is not as uncommon as you'd think.
No, well, there's a number of this. So there's a few things. So capitalism, the virtue of capitalism tends to be tied to the creativity of the great enrichment that Dietrich McCloskey talks about, is innovation. But the problem is the very successes of capitalism then creates incentives to turn against creativity, to solidify the wealth. That's why capitalism has a self-devouring tendency, but it doesn't have to have a self-devouring tendency, but it tends to. And one of the key, a very simple way that I would try to describe it in second thoughts is that the whole argument for capitalism is that the market is rational, right? You know, it's rational. And when people do what's in their self-interest, they tend to create wealth. And then the guy doesn't want to go out of business, so he'll cater to the customer. And the rationality of the market creates a game theory dynamic that benefits everyone, right? Generally, that's true. But do you know what's super rational? Do you know what's amazingly rational? To become invincible. Because once I become invincible, then I don't have to worry about ever failing, right? And the key to capitalism on the free market kind of libertarian Milton Friedman sort of structure, which they have incredibly good points and should be taken seriously, is that self-regulation and self-interest must always go together. Meaning that if I don't take care of you as a customer, I go out of business. So my self-interest is tied to my self-regulation. Self-regulation is the key. But you know, so it's rational before I'm invincible to keep self-interest and self-regulation together, right? But what if I become invincible? Well, then I don't have to self-regulate because there's nothing you can do to stop me, right? And so then the very rationality of the market that keeps self-interest and self-regulation together actually drives companies to becoming too big to fail, because then self-regulation and self-interest are separated. It also drives them to limit creative destruction. It drives them to buy up so many houses that if they go under, it bankrupts everyone, so the government will bail them out, right? Too big to fail is not a mistake of capitalism. It's the logical end of an autonomous rationality of capitalism that, until invincibility, keeps self-interest and self-regulation together. So the very rationality of capitalism is what drives it to becoming anti-creativity, anti-flexibility, anti-movement, anti-social selection. That was the very reason that generated the great enrichment in the first place. And so you really need to make sure the state keeps creativity going, right? You need to really make sure that no one can buy intellectual property rights that then keep the corporations forever, right? You really have to make sure, no matter what, that you never allow too big to fail to occur. Because here's the problem. Once it occurs, you're screwed. You're screwed. This is where the historic forcing function is at play now. And also, now the corporations have every incentive to get as effing big as they possibly can, just like governments do, actually. The bigger the debt, the more you can't afford for it to go down. Debt is not a mistake. It's what you want to do is increase the debt as fast as you can, because then you get a global debt bubble that's too big to fail, derivative market, et cetera, so forth. So too big to fail becomes the logical end of a rationality that wants to free itself from self-regulation. You see what I'm saying? So you have to create as much creative destruction as you can, because here's the problem. The moment you say we need to limit X, well, then there has to be someone to do that limiting. So you have power, right? And that means you have the people being limited have incentives to corrupt or to get around K Street, regulatory capture. Structures of having someone with power limiting don't tend to work. And that's where the libertarians are correct about the government. But then the people who support, say, the government are like, free markets never existed and the corporations are too big to fail. The most horrific position that I hold is that everyone is right. Which, wait a minute, everyone is right? Yeah, this sucks, right? That means the government can't regulate the market, but the market simultaneously has incentive to escape regulation. What do you do? What do you do with that? Well, it's all about the presence of creative destruction present by the subject who are not hindered by law or certification. And this is where Ivan Illich is so big, because certification radically decreases, I'm screaming now, radically decreases the amount of creative destruction in the system. Certification, regulation in terms of expertise, the expert class. Technology also problematically requires higher levels of education to handle. So that becomes a limiting principle. And then you have the intellectual property rights that keeps there from being creative destruction, because that whole realm is a complete disaster, in my opinion. Then also you have, the problem is then you use zoning laws or housing, like you have these horrific homeowners associations that then make it very difficult to buy housing. Housing goes up. Well, if housing goes up, who can have the capital to risk a company? You have assets going up that are incentivized by the stimulation of demand to deal with the great stagnation of the economy via inflation that is a result of the lack of wealth. All of these then come together to limit the creative destruction in the economy. Well, without that, you say, well, then we need power to limit, but power can't limit, and this is our situation, which then would suggest the need of some sort of forcing function, which hopefully won't kill us all. But if you were to at least, let me put it this way, the thing that we could do with the resources we have, because it would not seem you could legislate at this point, given K Street, Government's End, Marson Olson, and all these things, you couldn't legislate the market in this way because they're owned by the corporations. We really think that the government is going to reform intellectual property rights? Yeah, okay. Sure. They're not. But what you could do is reform the classroom to make people more open and capable of the creativity that if all the corporations go down in 10 years or whatever, they have the creativity to make up for it, right? They actually have the ability to generate new technologies to deal with that and to generate actually wealth creation and things like that. And that also critically, creativity is tied to prices coming down because creativity technology tends to reduce prices. So the amount of money that people would need as they retire and as they get older goes down as well. And the big one is, of course, healthcare. That needs so much innovation. It's unbelievable. And also, healthcare is a wonderful example of the danger of bureaucracy, right? Because most of the money goes to the healthcare bureaucracy at this point, right? Well, that's the problem you get when you need to have a state or a bureaucracy to limit something or to check something or to certify something. And then you get these healthcare network plans. All of these, you see, like the networks, most healthcare plans are on networks. You have like that right there destroys creative destruction, right? Because there's a limiting principle. You have to remove as many, walls. Let's call them walls versus limits, because Mr. Ebert, uses limit in a very critical and important way that goes with Hegel as a dialectic. You have all of these legal. That's the main thing. Like, I really go to town against legal things. We talk all the time about the market. We talk all the time about the state as a society. We don't focus enough on law, particular laws and certification that allow the growth of these overly large, Lepotko, cancerous, Ebert's language, structures that would not be there without the law as such, because they create the fences that allow all of these growths. So like truancy law. If you must send your kids to school or you go to jail, then the schools don't have an incentive to have quality. So truancy laws get into problem. I think the complexity of the tax system destroys creativity because people are scared to death to start their own business if the IRS is coming for them, right? I think you have to go to town. We talk, and then I'll give it back to you. And I don't actually know where the last 2 hours. You are just so great. You are so great. We focus a lot, in my opinion, again, on new models of voting, new models of representation, new governments, new business models, new models of market, new models of state, but we don't talk enough about the laws. The laws are the main things that get you into trouble. The laws are, because all of the institutions form relative to the laws, because the laws are the rules that are set the institutions. And the moment, though, you have laws, guess what? Guess who gets to write the laws? The powerful people. So, bam, laws also is what gives you so much of the social and power hierarchy that leads to all these problems. So we have to look at the laws, particular laws that you try to overturn and increase creative destruction. Any law, overturning laws is, to me, a much likely process to succeed without unintended consequences than a state that limits the market or a market that is set free from the government, which tends to be our political options. No, let's look at a particular law. Let's look at truancy laws. Let's look at these different ways, homeowner associations that causes houses to go up. Let's look at the different loans structures, right? You have to go bit by bit to look at these things. And the metric, because this gets back to the main question you were asking, because the question is, what is the metric of success? Right? Because I think you were pointing to that earlier. By which could you tell that you're succeeding or not? Well, first, metric of increasing, innovative, The increase of intrinsic motivation. Well, how do you measure that? Things like, are people bored? Do you have people that mental health? What is the state of the mental health of different things? Those all would suggest a lack of intrinsic motive. That would suggest an increase of intrinsic motivation. You could ask people, are they happy? There are happiness studies, but those tend to be problematic because people don't tend to admit if they are or not. But those might be if you had a different way of studying it or different things like that. The key would be also corporation turnover. How long do businesses last? Without creativity, without generating new products. So you could see the amount of turnover in the system would actually be an indication of success or not. The amount of also, like, you could actually look at diversity, but use it as a metric, not of like, because right now diversity is being top-down legislated, as opposed to creating an opening to see if people in their friend groups have diversity. That's kind of the key. If more and more people in their friend groups would have diversity there, that would suggest that people as subjects are able to handle diversity, right? Right now, we're trying to say people are diverse because, look, they make the quota. They met the law. Well, that's the whole problem. And here's the crazy thing about that. When you tell people you're going to go to jail or lose your job unless you're diverse, then they become what? Bitter. Then they're going to make a point not to have minority friends, right? Because they're angry, right? You try to legislate diversity, well, then you get an unintentional backlash. But what if you instead transform the system to make people excited and happy to handle diversity and see it as an opportunity for negentropy? Well, then people would be, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So then under those settings, friendship with diversity would be an indication of subjects that can handle difference, which would be an indication of success in different things. And then also you could look at diversity in communities at that point, right? Because you would see that like blacks, whites, Latinos, Americans, they're all hanging out in the same community, because right now we have some of the most segregated, self-segregated society we've ever seen, because people are moving around everyone that's liberal or everyone that's conservative or everyone that's like them. Right there is an indication that civilization is failing. So what we need is a success of pluralism, but the problem frickin' is right now that diversity has been captured as a metric. Diversity is being kind of forced as a multiculturalism that is very shallow, not deep, and it does not increase people's what you're getting is in the same way that right now education is testing for the grade, so people figure out how to get the A even if they don't learn anything. Right now you're basically telling everyone to be diverse, so they're figuring out social strategies to seem diverse or to look diverse without actually doing the work on the subject required for deep diversity, right? So as you test to the grade, you likewise right now are just testing to appearances of diversity that are not changing the subject or forcing them to really see beauty in the other. That's what you key. You must have the average person see diversity as beautiful, not merely different. Because if they merely see difference, they haven't as a subject come to value it. Thus, they're not going to choose it. Thus, they're not going to be changed by it. Thus, you're not going to have negentropy, right? So the strategies right now of dealing with diversity are on the level of the surface, the kind of cheap multiculturalism that Peter Berger, James Hunter, and all these people talked about, that is not working at all. Because all people do is get mad and resentful from their top-down overlords telling them that if they're not diverse, they're a bigot. So they backlash against that, and you get this explosion of resentment that's now defining the civilization, because the only way to have actual global pluralism and open is to work on the subject, to be open to the other person. But that's going to require you to stop legislating diversity, but with creating the space where people can encounter diversity as beautiful. But that requires them to be able to handle the what? The real of Lacan. The fact that, oh my gosh, people are deeply different. How do I even know what I believe? Why do I think the way that I do? How do I live? The true other makes you encounter all those realities about yourself. There's a reflective mirror. And if we don't have an education that can train people to handle that, they won't. And they'll talk about diversity all day long, but they will not be diverse. They will self-segregate. So self-segregation also becomes a metric to determine the success of the system, to see that if it's being reduced or not. So that would be another factor. There's a few more, but let me throw it back to you.
Hondo, and I think so many people, when you talk about like Mike, you just did a good lecture with DeBoer and Baudrillard about the spectacle, how like even when we're in public spaces, and we're not looking at our actual screens. We're seeing the world through these screens, right? But there are moments where those drop. And that's when it's about becoming interested in someone else's someone else's Dasein. Uh, and I think some of that, even becoming aware of it, could happen through eroticizing study. So you're kind of flirting with these texts. I mean, I am when I'm doing it. And there is a way, I think, to like apply this to a bunch of aspects of life. So you're reading a law and you're going, oh, okay, so in 2008, Lehman Bros got put out. And basically what happened is they moved this whole market from private to public, Freddie and Fannie, and are just like, oh yeah, it'll be fine. Sure, you know. And so you're like looking at it and you're like, oh, that seems awfully like a can kicking. Um, and how do you like, get people to understand and become interested in not what you were talking about, seeing just the difference, but the beauty. Because what I think happens is if you just see difference, it's actually very energetically draining.
Yes.
And it takes you just feel like time is just like barely moving versus really engaging and seeing I mean the person by their name, right? That means their particularity, not the sort of token appearance. And all of a sudden, I think you get access to exponential diversity verticals. So all of a sudden you say, okay, there are different height, different skin color, different gender, different religion, different nationality. But all of a sudden you go, oh, but they have different epistemological ideas. They've got different ontological ideas. Like all these things start, becoming things that you can just listen. I was talking to my girlfriend the other day, and she was like, I wish people would have a meter above their head with how conscious they are. And I was like, just listen to them talk for 90 seconds. Just listen to them speak. Listen to their art of ordering words, and you will figure it out. I said, well, you have to make a lot of assumptions. I'm like, okay, yeah, you do. But like those that can be trained, and that can be you can become you can have a decent consciousness radar if you do the requisite work with the consciousness you've been given. Because all of a sudden you'll start to be like, oh, it's a gym of sorts. You talk about training. Like it's something that competence can be built. And I don't know if tell me if you've ever had this experience. Have you ever met someone who you feel as if they've taken in a lot of information, but they haven't really allowed it to marinate and ask themselves, how do I feel about this before it comes back up? That it's just like in and then straight out. I mean, in a way, I think like universities are these bulimic type systems. They're teaching. They're like, we're just going to cram so much in there, spit it up, and then you're not going to have to worry about health insurance. That's my gauge. That's my gauge. Sometimes, like sometimes like how out there a personality is. I'll just be like, what kind of health insurance do you have?
That's actually a really good one. Oh, that's hilarious. A few things. That's exactly right. We classically, dare I say, or there have been other times in other civilizations where people associated education by your skills, your ability, not skills as in like on a work site, but like literally a tree fell and you're able, skill of surprise, like your ability to handle surprise. And if you have the skills to handle surprise, oh, wow, that's a capable person. It's also very interesting now that we emphasize being smart, where I do think there's something reductionistic about there, where we really should talk about capability. Are they capable? Can they? Enabled society, right? Also, like what you were saying about speaking, that's exactly right. But you have to be trained in speaking. And if the classroom taught you that, you could gauge competence. And also, one of the main things that I think causes drama in families or on the work side or between people is when people have something they can't say, or they feel something they can't articulate, they have an emotion they can't give a name to, or they don't know how to de-escalate. Like there's so much emphasis now on de-escalation. That's all speaking. That's all speaking. And if so, people can't speak, they can't de-escalate. And so they fight and you have all these family problems. And the other ability like that people used to, in my opinion, would associate in education with is the ability to solve problems that are in front of you. Like the electricity is out in the house. Now, there's a danger between life being about solving problems because the bigger problems are you can only manage them. But there is something to say about the ability to get the electricity back, or to fix the toilet, or to figure out how to de-escalate, like the ability to create serenity or to keep things from breaking. We now basically associate being educated with making a lot of money. Because if you think about it, that's at the end what it means. Oh, you must be educated because you got a high-paying job. So we assume the presence of competence by the presence of money. Now, I'm not going to demonize money. I think that's very dangerous of people to do. And I'm not even going to say that everyone who's rich is stupid or something like that. But so much of society is about systems of organizing information, and are they effective or not? And so is money an effective means to determine if someone is educated in the sense of competent? It does seem to be a pretty good one, I will say. They probably are not stupid. They probably actually are smarter than the average significantly. They're probably, I would say, they're probably IQ 110 over, right? So that's better than nothing. But can money tell you if they're creative, or if they're driven, if they have intrinsic motivation, if they're able to solve problems that are not given? No, it is not. It could be, but not always. Maybe you could make the argument that ultra money does, because they must have invented something that made them ultra money in the billions upon billions of dollars, or 3 billion or something. But maybe not. It depends on the details, right? So the question is money an effective means, a reliable indicator of the presence of competence? No, it's not reliable enough. It's better than nothing, but it's not great, right? What would be better? Speech. You're exactly right. Speech and the ability to, in a lived common life, see the kind of enablement the person has. This is all far better. But that would require people to have training to tell. And right now they have training to associate basically making money or following the track as a sign of competence. So that's another reason why the medium of education has to shift, because that as the classroom, the ethics, the medium condition that I talk about versus the material condition, the medium condition trains people in how they gauge competence or ability. And right now they tend to do it according to money, which lowers the capacity of being able to recognize enablement, which then and here's the problem, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because someone could listen to everything I'm saying about freeing up creative destruction and flow and flux, and you look around and say, but people are stupid. Well, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, see? Because you've created the conditions that make it seem insane to increase creative possibility, because people don't have that ability, right? So then it all has to change at once. And this is why, unfortunately, most of history, it tends to be disaster, because a disaster is something that forces everything to change at once. Because by definition, a disaster that's truly a disaster is what? Systemic. A systemic thing is something that affects everything, right? So the question is, if we want to change everything or all at once, what area increases the probability that you could actually do that? Education, law. Those basically are the two main ones, the classroom and the law. I would also say the living room in the kind of family, but then the question is, why are the parents going to be doing it? Well, if they grew up in a trivia classroom, why would the living room be different, right? So it probably is going to be the classroom, the law. You could say the pulpit, if people go to church, and that's where I've been speaking with Joel to change. Right now, it's basically a replica of the classroom, so of course it's not really working. So you could change the pulpit. You probably could change the State of the Union. Like you could change the sort of the structure. You could change the TV talk show host, which tends to be a trivia structure as well. You could transform the images that people see. You could do all of that, but I would put that all under the umbrella of changing the classroom, because you're probably not going to change it in all of those areas if you don't first change it in the classroom. So classroom and law would be the two things I really would personally emphasize. And then With that, you could talk about government investment multipliers according to a cone dynamic to spread things like the internet or Zoom to increase the probability. And to me, though, that would still go with the category of classroom, because that would be creating the condition of this classroom that's not just the classroom. Ultimately, it becomes every room. That's what you would be doing. You would be kind of contributing to an atmosphere where learning is just what you do because you're a human being. So I definitely think that right now you have a problem where people can't gauge competence because we're not thinking in terms of enablement, really. But then that would get into law and classroom. What do you think of that?
I think that the classroom as such has been subsumed by the state. The law has been subsumed by the market, the church too.
Yeah.
So this is a great opportunity for new emergences, like the unschooling movement, doing homeschooling. I loved your idea about the community, about where kids can come together. And I'm an actor, so I would think they would come together and put on a play.
Absolutely.
I think it'd be a great way for them to learn not only how to conduct themselves, but also how to speak, how to talk.
Yeah.
And then, obviously some kind of new religion, or combination of old religions. And then it also comes down to, I think, the time spent at the dinner table.
Yep.
I think that's very important. And can you be off your screens and have a conversation that may lead to a new type of subject, a new personhood, and also just like a place to kind of wonder, and just say, hey, like, this thing happened. What do you older people think? And this is assuming that the older people buy into the back and forth, instead of like, hey, listen to my authority. Here's the answer. Don't question it. So basically just more dancing everywhere.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. When I was in Chenzhou, China, they have these dance squares everywhere. They're pretty amazing. Every evening at like 5, they come out and dance. I'm definitely a big fan of the festival. I think I heard the Dalai Lama once say, and I really liked it. He said the world needs more festivals. Yeah. Community gatherings, town squares, markets, activity in the community that is festive, that shows the possibility. I mean, Joseph Piper, festival, the ability to occupy an alternative time. I'm a huge fan of those. I think those are examples. I don't know if the town having festival, that without changes in the classroom or law is not enough, but those are definitely things that can accelerate, multiply those other medium changes. Definitely a huge creation of town squares, gathering places. Like, one of the things that also I think sometimes gets us in trouble is we've linked sports and extracurricular activities to school. So therefore they become the things you do to get to college, as opposed to things you do to be in a community. So like, you form a team now to be the star athlete so you can put it on your resume. This destroys the spirit of competition in a valuable way, in my opinion, or it can. It just depends. So I think also there are some problems with that. What I would say, what you were saying too, is most authority now is based on force when it should be based on beauty. You follow what the person said because they're beautiful to you, or they're the beautiful wrestler. So yeah, I'm gonna, like, on the company, like Thymos, Raymond Owen was talking about, wow, you're the best soccer player. So of course I'm going to listen to you because I saw beauty. You didn't tell me to listen to you. I just saw the stripe. I want to be like that. So beauty becomes, so the thing I was going to say, and then feel free to reply, is I do think you're correct that someone like a guide, Highwood will talk about that, Layman Pascal, meta shaman, different things, becomes important here, because there needs to be hierarchy. But not the hierarchy that is the kind of, it's a hierarchy based on beauty that is particularized for the community, that cannot be universalized outside of it. So it's a kind of contained hierarchy, but the hierarchy is based on seeing, not force. And you see, he's the best soccer player, so he's the top of a hierarchy. But being the best soccer player is not very useful for painting, so the hierarchy is contained, where right now, basically, we assume someone the best at making money is the best at everything. So that's a problem, right? And also, like, what we need is a hierarchy that is bound to the particularity, and it's based on the beauty of expertise, not force, right? So that's how you get this kind of, you have differentiation, but it's not a power-based information. It's a beauty-based distinction, actually. But this is where beauty and philosophy and freeing of speech are all tied together, because the guide of philosophy, the key thing that the philosopher does is it's what Heidegger said. I was talking with Thomas Wynne about this and the freeing speech stuff, is that the philosopher is always saying you have an assumption there. You have a presupposition there. Oh, you can't make that conclusion yet. This is incredibly important because they keep the speech free. Like right now, we associate free speech with you have the right to express yourself. A presupposition is where your speech is no longer free. When you can't speak freely because you're stuck on the presupposition, or when you reach a conclusion, it's no longer free. So I like to talk about freeing speech, where the philosopher is in the business of freeing speech by making you see things you didn't know you had to still talk about, or an assumption you didn't know was there. So you have to keep speaking and relating and figuring out, because you can't stop now. You have to keep going. But here's the trick. How does that not turn into hopelessness? How does that not turn into like nihilism? If you say, okay, we never reach a conclusion, screw it, why even try? The philosopher keeps you on the Heideggerian path, the clearing, where they don't let you settle, but they also don't let you lose hope. They keep you going, but not feel like it's arbitrary. And this is why beauty is huge, because the philosopher has to condition you to experience more beauty, and therefore you don't want to stop. Like, you don't worry, like, we're never stopping. You're like, I'm glad we're never stopping. So the philosopher has to keep you from stopping while simultaneously conditioning you to experience more beauty so that you're motivated to keep going. This is the Goldilocks sweet spot, and why I think the fate of beauty is the fate of us, and why philosophy ultimately needs beauty, because that is the attraction that keeps you going. And also, it gets tied to the true, the beautiful, and the good, because the philosopher is saying you're actually not in truth right now. You have a presupposition. You have an assumption. Oh, and here's the beauty to keep you going, and it's good that you keep going. So the philosopher is to keep the subject in the place of those three. And the main way they do that, this is where Heidegger is good, is through the nihilation. They're always annihilating you, keeping you in the clearing, in the same way that in Dante, no, you can't stop here. You got to keep going, man. Keep climbing. You can't stop. Keep going. Keep going. But you don't want to stop. And this is the key. That is when the very inability to have an object of desire, and we spoke about this before, this is all negentropic. This is the negentropic breadboard. The philosopher is setting you up in the negentropic breadboard that we talked about in the relation with difference to then get the energy that then makes the very incompleteness of the subject exciting. The very fact you can never get the object of desire becomes a blessing, because that means you can always move toward beauty. Desire becomes drive when negated, sublated toward beauty. Otherwise, it confuses the beauty with an object, goes after something it can't get, and in a sense, it's God's grace that you don't get it, because that means there's still hope you get corrected toward the beautiful. The denial of the object has a grace in a certain Flannery O'Connor sense that increases the probability that you keep going, because the incompleteness of desire is the opportunity of drive that then becomes hopeful in beauty, and that drive then is the very revolutionary act of I prefer not to, because instead of Zizek, because instead of pursuing objects that consume and keep capitalism going, you are instead situated within capital according to a drive that the philosopher keeps you going toward, that you are motivated to go toward because it is beautiful, which creates an alternative energy to the system than the consumption. Ergo, you become a subject of which creates demand and creating drive that actually paradoxically increases the probability of wealth being created. And yet the very reason it was stopping all this was to make everyone richer. But since irony is the fabric of reality, this became an ironic act that led to the great stagnation or wealth inequality, where the philosopher is situating the subject to be rightly ordered so that wealth can be created according to beauty and not falling into these self-effacements. And then the inability to ever get the object is then a blessing, because the inability to get the object is the invitation to keep dancing. So I agree with you that we need more dancing. And the more that we would see dancing, the more that we would want dancing. If you had public squares where people were out dancing, then rather just seeing everyone sipping lattes or driving nice cars, you would see people dancing. If you saw festivals, you would see skills. All of these would then function as models of skills that you could work toward and then share with other people as gifts versus givens. And then if you had a classroom that incubated active focus of the subject on one another and kept you interested in learning, and then you had the legal structure to allow people to have the clearing to engage in all of these things, I think we would see the conditions of possibility within capital change. And I think that would address the metacrisis.
Well, when you come to Kansas City, we're going to Funky Town because it's one of these dance clubs that like seamlessly integrates 3 generations.
I am all about it.
Let's do it. I would say like the philosopher, what you're talking about with rightly ordered, to put it in today's context using Byung-Chul Han's achievement subject as a model, the specialist should probably seek to become more of a generalist, and the generalist should probably pick one thing and just go super deep.
Yes.
Having both of those at your disposal, I think just rounds out.
I think the human is happiness when they are an expert from a wide field of possibility. And I feel like that mixture is what is required. But that requires the commitment, the absolute choice, and the belief that the thing is worth doing. And in that would also suggest courage. And I think Mr. Ebert is correct that the meaning of life is courage. And in the creation of that courage, that would then be what is necessary to have the courage to dance. So we'll also do some square dancing, I think, because there's plenty here in Central Virginia for that. Philip, let's do that. It's a pleasure, sir. Thank you for your time on this pleasant day. It is always a treat. Best to you, sir.